It began with a knife that should never have left the prison kitchen, a small, ordinary blade hidden in a mattress, an object so trivial it might have seemed harmless. Yet from that oversight would come a chain of events that ended 5 lives and scarred a quiet region forever. This is the story of the Pottery Cottage murders of 1977, a case of violence born from neglect, desperation, and the unseen fractures in a nation struggling to hold itself together. The winter of 1977 settled over England with a suffocating stillness. The holiday season had passed, leaving the country half frozen and half broke. Unemployment crept higher each month, and discontent simmered through the unions and the streets. Inside Armley Prison, the cold was a constant companion. Its breath rising from stone walls, its echo carried down long corridors where men waited for their fates. Among them was William Hughes, a man whose life had already drifted beyond redemption. He was 30 years old, though his record made him sound much older. Theft, assault, battery, cruelty, destruction. Each charge was a stepping stone from youthful mischief to adult menace. He had become what the newspapers called a habitual offender, a label so familiar that even he had accepted it as his only identity. The file on him was thick, but its contents were mechanical, lines of text stripped of meaning, unstable, volatile, dangerous tendencies. Few within the system stopped to ask how he had become that way. Hughes had grown up moving between garrisons, the son of an army corporal whose discipline ended the moment alcohol began. Childhood had taught him the language of control and the silence of fear. When his father's drinking cost him his post, the family returned to the north of England, where a single wage barely fed 6 children. Poverty is rarely a crime, but it is often the seed of one. Hughes left school at 15, restless and angry, believing that strength was his only protection. He began stealing from parked cars, breaking into houses, fighting in alleys. Each arrest hardened him. When he was sent to a detention center for young offenders, he discovered the 2 currencies that mattered most: violence and defiance. Reform was a word the authorities liked to use, but it meant little within walls where humiliation passed for discipline. Hughes learned to lift weights, to intimidate, to meet pain with indifference. The system that was meant to correct him instead perfected him. By the mid-1960s, he had already lost touch with his family. For a brief period, he tried to work honestly, a metal polisher, a decorator's apprentice, a British rail trainee. But old habits returned with the first missed paycheck. His crimes grew meaner, his temper shorter. When he married a young woman named Jean, he saw her not as a partner, but as property. The violence he had learned as a language of survival became his dialect of love. In 1972, Jean's 5-year-old daughter from a previous marriage became his next victim. A fit of rage left the child with broken ribs and lifelong fear. For that, Hughes served a short sentence. When he was released, nothing changed. A year later, he assaulted 2 police officers during a drug arrest. The court handed him 3.5 years. By the time he was released again in early 1976, the world outside had grown suspicious of rehabilitation. Now, in the first weeks of 1977, Hughes found himself back in confinement, charged with rape and grievous bodily harm. His trial awaited at Chesterfield. He told himself he would never again see the inside of a prison cell after that hearing. He was done being handled by men who locked doors and filled forms. He wanted freedom at any cost, and he believed himself clever enough to take it. He had been working in the prison kitchens for several weeks, a privilege he had earned through good behavior. It gave him small freedoms, access to utensils, moments without supervision, and most importantly, tools. One of those tools was a 7-inch boning knife. He noticed it missing from the inventory sheet one day, but no one else did. That was when he began to plan. He hid the knife carefully, wrapping it in a cloth and burying it within the thin mattress of his bunk. The search procedures at Armley were perfunctory. Guards were few, the prison over capacity, and morale low. When a rumor of a missing blade circulated among staff, they conducted a brief search and moved on. Paperwork was filed, but the weapon remained exactly where Hughes wanted it. In his cell at night, he rehearsed the escape in his head. He would be transported to Chesterfield for the hearing, accompanied by 2 prison officers. He knew that some transfers used secure vans, others ordinary taxis. If he were lucky, the latter would be his chance. He thought through the sequence step by step. Conceal the knife, wait for the moment, strike fast, control the driver, vanish before the police could respond. He considered himself a strategist, not a murderer. That night, as wind whistled through the thin glass of the cell window, Hughes stared into the dark and thought of the open roads that stretched beyond the walls. He did not imagine snow or blood or the faces of those he would soon meet. He saw only freedom, the wide, blank horizon of a country he thought had wronged him. He told himself it was justice. By dawn, the prison stirred. The kitchen staff prepared breakfast, the guards assembled their escort lists, and the day began like any other. In his cell, Hughes dressed carefully. He put on a blue pinstriped suit, a floral shirt, and a white silk waistcoat, a costume of respectability for a man long divorced from it. He retrieved the knife from beneath his mattress and wrapped it once more. He placed it inside his underwear, where the fabric pressed it close to his skin. The escort officers assigned to him were named Donald Sprinter and Ken Simmons, routine professionals used to minor offenders. The report on Hughes described him as compliant, not violent, and so they saw no reason for alarm. There was no strip search. They frisked him lightly, found nothing, and noted his good manners. A taxi was already waiting outside the gate, its tires crunching over the frozen ground. The driver, David Reynolds, was not told much, only that his passenger was on remand and required escort to Chesterfield. He had made similar runs before. The officers took their seats. Sprinter in the front, Simmons beside Hughes in the back. Handcuffs linked Hughes to Simmons's wrist, but his right hand remained free. They set off at 8 in the morning, the city still half asleep under its pale winter sun. As the car merged onto the motorway, the landscape shifted from brick to open fields dusted with snow. Conversation filled the silence. Fishing, cars, the weather. Hughes laughed easily, his voice steady. No one suspected the tension under his calm exterior. At a service station, he asked to use the toilet. Permission was granted without hesitation. Inside, he unwrapped the knife and slid it into his jacket pocket, his hands steady despite the adrenaline that pulsed through them. When he emerged, Simmons cuffed him again. The drive resumed. The officers did not know that death sat between them now, quiet and composed. The taxi moved steadily through the falling snow, its windows fogging slightly from the warmth inside. None of the men realized that their journey, only a few hours across the Midlands, would soon fracture into chaos. By the time the taxi approached the turnoff for Chesterfield, the snowfall had thickened into a white curtain. Hughes flexed his fingers, feeling the cool metal of the blade through his coat. He waited for a lull in conversation, for the sound of the tires to steady. He inhaled once, as though to clear his mind, and then he acted. In a confined space, violence is almost silent. A single motion, a glint of steel, a gasp. The car swerved, tires skidding on ice. The officers cried out but did not die. Not yet. The driver shouted, confused, terrified. Blood splashed against glass, staining it pink beneath the snowlight. The knife had done its work, and with it the first link in the chain snapped free. Outside, the countryside waited, white, endless, and indifferent. The snow kept falling as the taxi sped along the A6117, its headlights carving thin tunnels of light through the white haze. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of blood and gasoline. The 2 prison officers were slumped, stunned but alive, their hands trembling as they pressed at their necks to stanch the bleeding. Donald Sprinter's breath came in gasps, fogging the cold glass beside him. Ken Simmons stared at the knife, still gleaming in the faint morning light, and could not comprehend how quickly order had turned to horror. William Hughes sat back, panting quietly, his right hand gripping the weapon as if it were an extension of himself. The act had come almost naturally, an eruption of movement guided by instinct and anger. He was surprised by the silence that followed. The car continued forward, steady and calm, as though the machine itself had no regard for human drama. He leaned forward and pressed the blade against the driver's ribs. His voice, when it came, was low and measured. He ordered David Reynolds to keep driving. The man obeyed, hands rigid on the steering wheel, eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror in quick, terrified glances. Hughes told him to take the next turnoff, away from Chesterfield, away from any route where police might wait. Reynolds followed the command, turning onto a narrow country lane that wound upward through the Derbyshire hills. The road here was half buried in snow, bordered by dry stone walls that curved like old scars through the landscape. Sheep stood motionless in fields, their wool coated in frost. Everything seemed suspended, frozen in a moment that would not end. Behind them, Sprinter whispered a prayer, his voice breaking. Simmons tried to shift, but Hughes barked at him to stay still. The driver's heart beat so loudly he could feel it in his throat. Hughes ordered him to stop at the next lay-by. They pulled over near the base of Stannington Hill, where the wind swept down from the moor in sharp, unrelenting gusts. Hughes forced the wounded men out of the car. They stumbled into the snow, red droplets spattering against the white. Reynolds hesitated, his hands shaking violently, but Hughes pressed the knife against his spine and ordered him to move away. He took the driver's seat, slammed the door, and with a screech of tires, sped off into the white wilderness. The taxi fishtailed on the icy surface, its engine roaring. The steering wheel trembled in his hands. Hughes had never been an accomplished driver, but adrenaline guided him now, sharp and mechanical. He laughed once, a short, jagged sound that cut through the hum of the engine. In his mind, this was victory. He was free. The road narrowed as it climbed, snowdrifts pushed against the edges, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Hughes leaned forward, squinting through the blur until the car skidded violently. The rear end swung out, slammed against a low stone wall, and came to a halt with a shudder. The bonnet hissed, steam rising into the air. The radiator had split. For a long moment there was silence, just the ticking of the cooling engine and the whisper of snow against metal. Hughes stepped out, breathing heavily, knife still in hand. He looked around. The world was empty. No cars, no people, only the endless moorland stretching to the horizon. He began to walk. The wind hit him with the force of a blow. Within minutes, his shoes were soaked, his trousers stiff with ice. He trudged forward, each step sinking into the snow. The moor spread out before him, an immense white expanse where all sense of direction dissolved. There was no path, only instinct, and Hughes followed it. Somewhere behind him, the men he had left bleeding by the roadside were found by a passing recovery driver who stopped to investigate the abandoned vehicle. They were taken to hospital, barely conscious but alive. Within the hour, police knew an armed fugitive was loose in the countryside. By then, Hughes had vanished into the wilderness. He walked for hours, his breath a pale vapor against the sky. His suit, chosen to make him look respectable in court, was now drenched and stiff. The silk waistcoat clung to his chest like paper. He had not planned for this. He had imagined an easy escape, a quick car theft, a train perhaps, a chance to disappear among the industrial towns of the north. He had not imagined trudging through snow, his legs shaking, his fingers numb. Still, he pressed on. Hunger clawed at him. Cold gnawed at his bones. Yet what sustained him was anger, the same bitterness that had propelled him through every punishment life had offered. Anger at his father, at the guards, at the world that had labeled him a lost cause. In his mind, he was still fighting an injustice he could not name. He crested a low hill and saw, in the distance, a cluster of stone buildings. Smoke curled from a chimney. The sight pulled him forward like a magnet. Civilization meant warmth, food, shelter. Perhaps a car, perhaps someone gullible enough to believe a polite stranger stranded in the storm. He reached the edge of the village of Eastmoor, a scattering of cottages near the boundary of the Peak District National Park. The wind dropped slightly here, the valley shielding him from the worst of it. He moved quietly, slipping between hedgerows and trees until he came to a gate. A wooden sign on the wall beside it read, "Pottery Cottage." Beyond the gate stood a modest stone house, 19th century, its windows glowing with the yellow light of a fire. A small annex joined it on the side, and the garden was lined with shrubs and a pair of horseshoes hanging for luck. Hughes watched for several minutes, studying the place. He saw an older woman moving about in the kitchen. He tried the gate. It opened without sound. A shed stood near the path, its door half open. Inside, he saw an axe leaning against the wall, a log pile beside it. He picked up the weapon, feeling its weight. Then he walked quietly to the back door of the cottage. The handle turned easily. The door was unlocked. Inside, the warmth struck him like a wave. The smell of cooking filled the air, onions perhaps, and meat. The woman turned, startled, and he was upon her before she could scream. His hand covered her mouth, the axe raised. Her eyes widened with terror, but he whispered that if she stayed quiet, he would not hurt her. Her name was Amy Minton. She was 68 years old, retired, gentle, the kind of woman who kept her house tidy and her heart open. Her husband, Arthur, lived with her in the adjoining annex. They shared the home with their daughter Jillian, her husband Richard Moran, and the couple's adopted daughter Sarah. They were not wealthy, but they were content. Ordinary people whose greatest misfortune was to leave a door unlocked on a snowy morning. Amy nodded, trembling. Hughes lowered the axe slightly. He told her he had escaped from prison and needed a place to rest. He said no one would be harmed if they cooperated. His voice was calm, even courteous. That was the danger of men like him, brutality dressed in politeness. Moments later, Arthur entered the kitchen, drawn by the noise. He stopped at the doorway, confusion turning to anger. He demanded to know what was happening. Hughes shoved him to the floor and repeated his warning. The old man's resistance melted into silence. Amy, shaking, made him tea. The ritual comforted her. It also pleased Hughes. It made the intrusion feel civilized. He sat at the table, dripping melted snow onto the floor, and drank slowly. Between sips, he asked questions. How many lived in the house, when they would return, whether anyone else might visit. When Amy told him her daughter and granddaughter would be home later that day, he smiled faintly. It was a smile without warmth. He thanked her for the tea and said again that no one needed to get hurt. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering the road, silencing the world. Inside, time seemed to slow. The cottage, once a refuge from the storm, had become its own prison. Hughes looked around, studying the furniture, the photographs on the mantel, the rhythm of domestic peace. It was everything he had never known: order, love, security, and for that reason, he despised it. He took off his wet jacket, hung it by the fire, and began to wait. The kettle whistled softly. Amy's hands trembled as she refilled his cup. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 3. The door opened again. Tires crunched outside. Footsteps crossed the threshold. Jillian Moran had come home. Jillian Moran stepped into the cottage carrying the smell of the outside world with her. Cold air, damp wool, and the faint trace of diesel from the roads she had driven along. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the wind, her gloves damp with melted snow. It had been another ordinary workday at the accountancy office in Chesterfield. She was thinking about dinner, about Sarah's school project, about the tedious letter she needed to post that evening. Then she saw the man sitting at her kitchen table. At first, the scene didn't register as danger. The figure appeared calm, almost polite. He was dressed for a court appearance, a suit and tie that made him seem misplaced rather than threatening. But then she noticed her mother's hands, white at the knuckles as she held a teapot, and the unnatural stiffness of her father's posture near the doorway. The man turned slightly, and Jillian saw the blade of an axe leaning against his chair. In that instant, the air in the room changed. The warmth of the fire became oppressive. The smell of cooking turned sour. She understood wordlessly that this stranger had come not as a guest, but as a captor. Hughes rose from his seat and spoke in a tone that was steady and strangely courteous. He told her not to be afraid, that he needed help, that if everyone cooperated, no harm would come. He mentioned a car breakdown, a snowstorm, bad luck. His voice had the cadence of practiced persuasion, low, reasonable, with just enough authority to command obedience. Jillian nodded, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She sat when he told her to sit. Behind her, Amy's eyes glistened with silent tears. Arthur's hands shook where they rested on the arm of a chair, his instinct to fight suppressed by the realization that this man was already beyond reason. They waited in stillness. Outside, the daylight was already dimming, though it was only mid-afternoon. The snow thickened again, settling over the garden in soft white folds. Each passing minute erased the possibility of help, sealing the cottage off from the world. When Sarah returned home at 4 o'clock, she burst through the door with her usual cheerful energy, clutching a school certificate in one mittened hand. She announced she had won first prize in the long jump. Her voice filled the house with innocent joy for a moment before she stopped and looked around. The atmosphere felt wrong. Her parents and grandparents sat too still, their smiles forced, and the stranger, tall and wild-eyed, stood beside the fire watching her. Jillian told her gently that the man was a traveler whose car had broken down, that he would be leaving soon. The lie came easily. It was the only thing she could offer her daughter, an illusion of normality. Hughes seemed pleased by her attempt at composure. He even smiled as though enjoying the theater of his own power. He said he, too, had a daughter named Nicola. He spoke her name as if it were a talisman, proof that he understood family life, that he could be trusted. But the truth was darker. Nicola, his real daughter, had once been a child he held by the throat during an argument with her mother. Compassion was foreign to him. Family was only a word, an empty shape he used to manipulate others. Evening descended. The radio murmured in the background, broadcasting warnings of worsening weather. Roads were closing, power lines faltering under ice. The snowstorm would last through the night, the announcer said, the worst in 50 years. Inside Pottery Cottage, the fire crackled, the flames reflected in the blade of the axe leaning by Hughes's chair. When Richard Moran arrived home at 6, fatigue written across his face, he sensed something wrong before he even stepped into the kitchen. The house was too quiet. Through the doorway he saw his wife, his in-laws, and the man with the wild, sharp features. Hughes turned slowly toward him. Their eyes met, a silent understanding that the normal order of life had been broken. Richard's instinct was to confront, to protect. He took a step forward, but Hughes moved faster. In one motion, he grabbed Jillian by the arm, pressed the knife against her throat, and ordered Richard to the floor. The suddenness of it stunned everyone. Amy cried out. Arthur rose half from his chair and was shoved back down. Sarah screamed. Hughes barked at them to be silent. His voice, once calm, now carried an edge of fury that made obedience absolute. Richard lay face down on the carpet, breathing heavily, the smell of dust and fear filling his lungs. Plastic ties from the kitchen drawer were used to bind his wrists. One by one, the rest of the family was tied and gagged, each carried or dragged to a separate room. Hughes moved with precision. He had done this before, not exactly this, but acts of control, of possession. Violence was his only form of order. Arthur struggled the most. He shouted through the gag, kicked at his captor, tried to free himself. The old man's defiance seemed to irritate Hughes in a way the others did not. When he finally subdued Arthur, he left him tied in an armchair in the sitting room, breathing hard but still glaring at him. Hughes turned away, pacing. Then something changed in his expression, an inward flicker of rage or confusion. Without warning, he stepped forward and plunged the knife into Arthur's chest. The act was sudden, silent, almost casual. Blood spread darkly across the man's cardigan, steam rising faintly in the heat of the room. Amy screamed through her gag. Sarah tried to crawl toward her grandfather. Hughes pushed them both aside, his breathing quickening. What had begun as an escape had now turned into something else, something he could no longer control. The taste of violence had reawakened something that prison had never erased. He dragged Sarah into the annex and closed the door. What happened next was a frenzy of movement and sound that ended in stillness. When he emerged, his face was blank, his clothes stained. He tied the door shut behind him, as though sealing away the evidence of what he had done. Upstairs, Jillian sat bound, tears running silently down her face. She did not know what she had heard, only that it had been the end of something. Her mother's sobs echoed faintly through the house, a sound both human and helpless. Hughes returned, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and sat once more by the fire. The radio was still playing. He lit a cigarette and stared into the flames, the knife lying beside him on the table like a tool waiting for use. Outside, the snow continued to fall, heavy and unrelenting. Police checkpoints were being set up across Derbyshire, roadblocks manned by tired officers scanning for a fugitive described as armed and dangerous. They were looking west, toward the towns and highways, not here, where he sat among the dead and the living, secure in his isolation. Night deepened. In the cottage, only the crackle of the fire broke the silence. Hughes rose once to check the windows, locking them carefully, drawing the curtains tight. He glanced toward the annex where he had left Sarah and Arthur, and then back at Jillian, whose face was pale with exhaustion. He told her softly that no one else would be hurt if she behaved. She nodded, unable to speak. Then, as if nothing had happened, he asked her to make him tea. She obeyed, her hands shaking so badly that she spilled water on the stove. He watched her closely, his expression unreadable, the faint glow of satisfaction flickering in his eyes. It was not desire, not even cruelty. It was control. For the first time in years, he was the master of his own small world. He drank the tea slowly. When he had finished, he gestured toward the sofa and told her to sit beside him. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each second another small eternity. Jillian stared at the patterned rug beneath her feet, willing herself not to cry. The smell of blood mingled with the scent of coal smoke and damp wool, creating an atmosphere that felt unreal, dreamlike, as though the house had slipped into another dimension where time no longer obeyed human rules. Upstairs, the old floorboards creaked under the weight of cold air. The wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and then was silent. In the small hours, Hughes moved through the house with slow, deliberate steps, checking the doors, rearranging his surroundings. He hummed under his breath, a shapeless tune that drifted through the rooms like a lullaby. The family lay tied, half-conscious, too terrified to sleep but too numb to resist. When he finally returned to the armchair beside the fire, he looked around the room with a strange satisfaction. The storm had cut them off completely. The radio announced road closures, warnings for travelers to stay indoors. He smiled faintly. He was safe here, for now. And in the annex behind a locked door, the radio played softly beside the bodies of those he had silenced. Morning arrived in faint shades of gray, filtered through the snow clouds that still hung low over the Derbyshire hills. The cottage, half buried beneath white drifts, looked from the outside like a scene from a winter postcard, still, peaceful, and warm. Inside, it had become a chamber of quiet horror. The fire had burned low in the hearth, reduced to glowing embers, and the air smelled faintly of smoke, sweat, and fear. William Hughes woke first. He sat for several minutes without moving, studying the room around him as if to memorize it. The storm had isolated the house from the outside world completely. The roads would be impassable for miles. He knew this bought him time to plan, to rest, to regain his strength. His mind, however, was not at rest. It darted between thoughts like a trapped insect, from the satisfaction of survival to the thrill of control, from guilt to denial and back again. He rose, stretched, and walked quietly through the house. The only sounds were the creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the radio that had played through the night. The newsreader's calm voice spoke of traffic accidents, freezing temperatures, and shortages of coal deliveries in the north. There was no mention of him yet. That absence pleased him. In the annex, behind the locked door, silence was absolute. He stood outside for a moment, listening, and then turned away. Some part of him registered what he had done there, but the recognition did not carry remorse. For Hughes, violence was not tragedy. It was merely consequence. Each act erased the threat of disobedience, simplifying the world into categories he could understand, those who submitted and those who did not. In the main bedroom, Jillian lay awake, still bound but no longer gagged. She had drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, haunted by fragments of sound. The shuffle of his steps, the occasional scrape of furniture being moved, the hiss of the kettle on the stove. She had not heard her father or her daughter since the previous evening, but she clung to the belief that they were alive. She had to believe it. Disbelief would mean surrender. Hughes entered the room carrying a tray. He had made tea and toast, setting them on the bedside table as if attending to a patient. The gesture was deliberate, almost tender. He told her to drink, saying she would need her strength. His tone was measured, almost conversational. Jillian obeyed, her trembling hand spilling tea onto the sheets. When she dared to ask where her father was, Hughes replied that he was resting in the annex. He said that Sarah was there too, that both were fine. His voice was steady, his expression calm. He had learned long ago that lies delivered with confidence could masquerade as truth. Jillian wanted to believe him. Her mind, desperate for order, accepted the fiction because it was easier than facing the unknown. Later that morning, a knock came at the door. The sound startled them both. Hughes turned sharply, his hand tightening on the knife that never left his side. Jillian's heart pounded. For a brief, electric moment, she thought rescue had come. It was only the septic tank maintenance man, there for the routine waste removal. Through the narrow crack of the door, Jillian saw the man's red face, his wool hat crusted with frost. He smiled politely and handed her the service sheet to sign. She stood frozen, the pen hovering over the paper. She could have spoken, could have whispered a single word to alert him. But she saw Hughes standing just behind her, unseen by the visitor, his face expressionless, but his eyes locked on hers. She felt the blade press lightly against her back. She signed, handed the sheet back, and closed the door. Her hand shook as the latch clicked into place. Hughes leaned close and whispered that she had done the right thing. He said she was smart, that he trusted her now. His approval made her sick, but it also meant she was alive for another day. In the kitchen, Amy sat slumped at the table, her wrists bound loosely now. Her hair was gray and matted, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She watched Hughes move about the room, her thoughts looping endlessly around the same question. Why had he come here? Why their family? What possible good could come from such madness? But she said nothing. Every word she had learned risked punishment. Hughes spoke occasionally as if to fill the silence. He told them about his life, about the jobs he had held and lost, about the injustice of the courts. His narrative shifted constantly. Sometimes he was the victim, sometimes the hero, sometimes merely misunderstood. Jillian listened, numb, realizing he believed none of it yet needed to keep talking to justify himself. Outside, the storm continued to isolate the house. The snow muffled every sound, turning the landscape into a white desert. Police search teams, miles away, trudged through fields and barns, knocking on doors that led nowhere. Their dogs struggled to track any scent. Every trace of Hughes's passage had been buried under a new layer of snow. The search centered west of the crash site, where they believed he might have fled toward Manchester. Pottery Cottage, lying just beyond their mapped radius, remained untouched. That afternoon, the sky darkened again. The radio spoke of worsening conditions. Hughes smoked by the window, watching the flakes spiral downward. He seemed almost content, as though the world outside no longer existed. Occasionally, he glanced toward the annex, then back at Jillian. He told her that the snow was a sign, proof that fate had chosen to hide him. He said he would stay only until it cleared, then he would move on, leaving them unharmed. The lie was effortless. To maintain the illusion, he performed small rituals of normality. He asked Jillian to make dinner. He pretended to carry plates into the annex, returning minutes later to say that Sarah and Arthur were eating well. He spoke of Sarah's smile, of how she had said she wanted to listen to the radio. The fabrication was detailed enough to be convincing. Jillian clung to it because she could not imagine the alternative. When night fell, Hughes told them all to sleep. He sat in the armchair again, the firelight flickering across his face, the knife resting on his thigh. His eyelids drooped occasionally, but his body remained taut, like a spring held under tension. Amy's quiet sobs filled the darkness. Jillian whispered to her mother that it would be all right, that they just had to endure until the police came. Neither of them truly believed it, but hope was the last comfort available. Hours passed. The cottage was wrapped in an unnatural stillness. Occasionally, the timbers groaned under the weight of snow. The wind pressed against the eaves, rattling a loose tile. Hughes stirred once, murmuring something incoherent in his sleep, a fragment of memory or rage. Just before dawn, Jillian opened her eyes to find him watching her. He smiled faintly, almost kindly, and told her it was nearly over. He said he would be gone soon, that they would have their home back. She nodded, though a chill ran through her at the softness of his voice. In that moment, he seemed less like a man and more like something elemental, cold, unpredictable, beyond reasoning. The fire crackled once more, throwing sparks that drifted up the chimney. The smell of smoke mingled with the faint metallic scent that had begun to permeate the house. Outside, the snow was easing, but inside Pottery Cottage, time remained frozen. And somewhere, in the annex, where the locked door stood against the cold, two bodies lay side by side beneath a thin blanket. The radio still played softly beside them, its static blending with the whisper of wind through the walls. By dawn on Thursday, the 13th of January, the storm had turned the Derbyshire moors into a wasteland of white silence. Fields, roads, and hedgerows had merged into one colorless expanse, as though the land itself had ceased to exist beneath the snow. The radio continued its warnings: motorists stranded, livestock lost, telephones dead. It was the kind of weather that made the world shrink, each household reduced to its own small circle of heat and light. Within that isolation, William Hughes found safety. In the police stations of Chesterfield and Bakewell, the manhunt was already underway. News of the attack on the two prison officers had spread quickly. Posters bearing Hughes's mugshot, his uneven features, his cold blue eyes, were pinned to notice boards across the county. Helicopters were grounded by the storm, so the search relied on foot patrols, police dogs, and word of mouth. The assumption was simple: no man could survive long on the open moor in this weather. If Hughes lived, he must have stolen a car or forced shelter in one of the nearby towns. But the Peak District is a deceptive landscape. Its villages hide within valleys and folds of earth, small and self-contained, often invisible from the main roads. Pottery Cottage was one such place, nestled beyond the mapped radius of the official search area. It did not appear on the police's list of addresses to be checked, a single oversight among hundreds of others. The officers who trudged through neighboring lanes that morning did not know that the man they sought was already sitting by a fire, sipping tea prepared by the people he held hostage. Inside the cottage, time moved differently. Hughes had begun to settle into his new role as master of the house. The violence of the previous night had drained from him, replaced by a peculiar calm. He was meticulous about his appearance, washing his hands, combing his hair, straightening his tie. He wanted to feel civilized again, as though surface order could erase what lay beneath. He allowed Jillian more movement now, untying her wrists so she could make breakfast. The illusion of cooperation suited him. It gave him control without effort. Amy sat motionless at the table, her eyes empty. Every movement, every sound seemed amplified. The clink of a cup, the slow drag of Hughes's cigarette, the steady hiss of snow sliding from the roof. He spoke occasionally, rambling about his childhood, his time abroad, the injustice of his life. Sometimes he blamed the army for his father's downfall, sometimes the teachers who had mocked him, sometimes the courts that had refused to see his worth. His self-pity was endless, looping back on itself like a prayer. Jillian listened because silence was more dangerous. She learned to murmur agreement at the right moments, to appear sympathetic, to make him feel understood. When he told her he needed cigarettes, she offered to fetch them from the village shop. Hughes hesitated, but then agreed. The roads, he reasoned, were still blocked. She could not escape far, even if she tried. Before she left, he reminded her that Amy and Richard were still his hostages, that any wrong move would mean their deaths. His voice was almost gentle, but the threat was absolute. Jillian drove slowly through the deep snow, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The short journey to the shop felt like crossing into another world. The streets were quiet, the few villagers she saw trudging through the drifts with their heads bent against the wind. Inside the small general store, the warmth and ordinary chatter almost broke her composure. The shopkeeper greeted her cheerfully, asking how the family was coping with the storm. For a moment, she considered saying everything about the stranger, the knife, the bodies she had not seen but could feel, haunting the air of her home. But fear silenced her. She smiled faintly, bought the cigarettes and a newspaper, and left. On the drive back, she imagined what would happen if she simply kept going, followed the road south until the fuel ran out, abandoned the car, begged for help. But then she saw her mother's face in her mind, the quiet surrender that had replaced all expression. She could not leave her behind. When she returned, Hughes took the newspaper first. He spread it on the table, scanning the front page. The escape was headline news now. His photograph stared back at him beneath bold black letters. Violent convict on the run. He read every line carefully, muttering under his breath, half amused, half proud. The story detailed the attack on the officers, their critical condition, the nationwide alert. It speculated that Hughes might have hitched a ride toward Manchester. The police, it said, believed he was armed and highly dangerous. He folded the paper neatly, as though it were an artifact of his own importance. Then he looked at Jillian. "They think I'm long gone," he said, and laughed quietly. That evening, he kept the charade alive. He pretended again to deliver dinner to the annex, returning with an empty plate and a satisfied expression. Jillian could not bring herself to ask about Sarah or her father. The possibility of an answer was unbearable. She told herself that if they were dead, she would know somehow, that a mother must feel such a loss instinctively. But intuition can be mercifully blind when survival depends on denial. The hours dragged. Hughes grew restless. He paced through the rooms, checked the windows, adjusted the curtains. The snow had stopped, and the night sky had cleared to reveal a pale moon that glowed over the fields. Its light pooled on the floorboards, ghostly and cold. Hughes stared at it for a long time, then turned away. Upstairs, Richard remained tied on the landing, his body bruised from struggling against the plastic ties. He could hear every sound from below, the footsteps, the muted conversation, the clink of glass. His mind raced through possibilities. If he could free one hand, if he could lunge at the man, if he could just get to the phone. But each scenario ended in failure, in the image of his wife or mother-in-law being killed before his eyes. He stayed still, breathing shallowly, waiting for an opportunity that would never come. At midnight, Hughes decided they would all sleep downstairs. He moved them into the lounge, arranging them like pieces of furniture under his control. The fire was kept burning bright. The warmth, he said, would keep them alive through the cold night. To Jillian, it felt like the light of an interrogation lamp. He spoke for hours, meandering between confession and justification. He said he had never meant to hurt anyone, that the system had forced his hand, that he was only doing what he had to do. Jillian realized that he needed her attention more than he needed her fear. To him, she had become both audience and prize, a witness to his self-made mythology. When she grew too exhausted to respond, he told her again that he had a daughter. He described her in tender detail, her blonde hair, her small hands. He said he missed her terribly. His eyes softened as he spoke, but behind that tenderness was something distorted, a longing not for love but for control, for ownership. Jillian recognized it. She'd seen the same possessiveness in the way he handled them all. Outside, the wind began to rise again. The snow that had briefly melted during the day now refroze into sheets of ice. Police operations were scaled back for the night. Searchers retreated to stations and local inns to rest, unaware that their quarry was only a few miles away, sitting by a fire in the company of his captives. At 2 a.m, the fire crackled low. Hughes's voice had fallen silent. He sat staring into the embers, his face illuminated in flickering orange. The room smelled of wood smoke and stale fear. Jillian, half-conscious with fatigue, watched him through half-closed eyes. For a brief second, she imagined him as something other than human, an embodiment of the storm itself, cruel and indifferent, moving through the world without reason. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch snapped outside, the sound sharp and sudden. Hughes lifted his head, his eyes flicked toward the window, alert again. The moment of calm was gone. He stood slowly, the knife glinting in his hand, and walked toward the window to peer into the night. The silence returned, deeper than before. And behind the locked door of the annex, the radio still played its soft, endless static, filling the void where voices should have been. Morning arrived in a fragile hush, the sort of quiet that settles after a storm but before the world has found its rhythm again. The snow had stopped falling, but it lingered thickly on the ground, turning the lanes and hedgerows of Eastmoor into a pale labyrinth. Sunlight glimmered faintly on the frozen drifts, though it carried no warmth. Inside Pottery Cottage, the air had the heavy stillness of exhaustion. William Hughes stood at the window for a long time, watching the first shafts of light strike the fields. His breath misted against the glass. He was tired but calm. The night had been long, yet he felt triumphant in a quiet, private way. He had outwitted the police, survived the storm, and established total control over the small world within these stone walls. For a man who had spent most of his life being confined by others, that control was intoxicating. Behind him, Jillian stirred on the sofa. Her neck ached, her eyes were raw, and her hands trembled as she tried to adjust her position. The fire had burned low. Only faint embers glowed now. Across the room, Amy sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. The room smelled of damp ash and unwashed fabric. The smell of fear, Jillian thought, was something that clung to every surface. Hughes turned from the window and announced that he wanted breakfast. His tone was casual, as though this were any ordinary morning. He untied Jillian's wrists and told her to make tea. She obeyed automatically. The simple act of filling a kettle, of hearing the soft rush of water and the clink of cups, was surreal. Each movement reminded her of a world that existed beyond this nightmare, a world where breakfast meant safety, not survival. While she moved about the kitchen, Hughes picked up the newspaper from the previous day. He unfolded it with care, smoothing the creases on the table. The story of his escape dominated the front page again. He read every line aloud, as though savoring his own notoriety. The words armed, dangerous, and unpredictable pleased him. They confirmed what he already believed, that he was a man the world should fear. When Jillian set his tea before him, He smiled faintly and thanked her. Then, with deliberate calm, he told her she would need to make a few phone calls. He instructed her to telephone her workplace and her husband's, explaining that both of them were unwell and would not be in that day. He gave her the script, line by line, and stood close enough that she could feel his presence behind her as she dialed. Her voice was steady. Years of office work had trained her to sound composed even under pressure. She told her supervisor that she had caught the flu, that she hoped to return soon. Then she called Richard's employer, repeating the lie. When she hung up, she realized her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Hughes nodded approvingly. "That's good," he said. "That'll stop anyone worrying." The next call was to Sarah's school. Jillian's throat closed when he handed her the phone. She could barely form the words as she told the headmistress that her daughter was ill, that she would stay home for the week. She imagined the classroom, the rows of desks, Sarah's friends whispering when they noticed her absence. It felt like a betrayal of the life they had built together, a surrender to the lie that was keeping her alive. When the calls were finished, Hughes seemed satisfied. He moved through the house with an air of authority, as though he owned it. He examined cupboards, opened drawers, and commented on small details, the polished furniture, the family photographs, the embroidered curtains. He said the house reminded him of his mother's, though the softness in his voice was brief, quickly replaced by the cold precision of a man cataloging his possessions. Around midday, he announced that he needed more supplies. He listed items, food, cigarettes, batteries, and told Jillian she would have to go into town again. She protested weakly, saying the roads were still treacherous, but he dismissed her concern. The snow was clearing, he said. People would be out and about again. The errand would make things look normal. Before she left, he reminded her that her mother and husband were still in his hands. He didn't need to raise his voice. The quietness of his words made them more terrifying. Jillian nodded and took the car keys. As she drove away, she looked in the mirror and saw him standing at the gate, the knife glinting at his side. The village looked transformed in daylight. Children were dragging sleds through the snow, and neighbors called greetings to one another as they cleared their paths. To Jillian, it was a cruel parody of normality. She parked near the high street and walked into a small hardware store, buying the things Hughes had demanded. Each interaction felt detached, dreamlike. She wondered if her voice sounded strange, if anyone could see the terror in her eyes. No one did. When she returned, Hughes was waiting at the door. He took the bags from her hands and inspected the contents carefully. Then he asked, almost conversationally, if she had spoken to anyone. She shook her head. He stared at her for a long moment, then smiled again. "You did well," he said. "You can be trusted." That phrase, "you can be trusted," echoed in her mind long after he left the room. Trust, she realized, had become a currency in this house, one that could buy small freedoms but at an unbearable cost. That evening, he told her that he might leave soon. He said the snow was melting, that he could find another car, another safe house. The words filled her with fragile hope. She dared to imagine the moment he would walk out the door and vanish, but even as he spoke, he was restless. His eyes darted from window to window, his mind racing ahead to dangers unseen. He talked about the police, about the prisons, about men who wanted him dead. Paranoia seeped into his voice like poison. To soothe him, Jillian made dinner. She served it in silence while he listened to the radio. The announcer's voice mentioned the continuing search, the warning to the public not to approach the fugitive. Hughes turned the volume up. "Listen to that," he said. "They're wasting their time. They'll never find me." He ate greedily, as if he were trying to consume his fear. When he finished, he carried 2 plates toward the annex, performing his grotesque pantomime once again. Jillian watched him disappear through the doorway and return several minutes later, saying that Sarah was resting and that her grandfather had eaten well. The details made the lie more convincing. For a brief second, she felt a flicker of relief, even though deep down she knew it could not be true. Later, when the house was quiet, she asked him why her daughter hadn't called for her comfort toy. Sarah always slept with a small gray elephant, a tattered thing she had loved since infancy. Hughes hesitated, then smiled. He said he would take it to her. He picked it up from the mantel and walked toward the annex. When he returned, he claimed Sarah had been delighted that she had kissed the toy and gone back to sleep. The story was too detailed, too practiced. Jillian turned her face away and said nothing. Night fell again. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moonlight. The police, their search hampered by the weather, had reduced their patrols to major roads. No one yet imagined that the missing fugitive was hiding in a farmhouse, less than 10 miles from where he had escaped. Inside Pottery Cottage, Hughes smoked by the fire, lost in thought. Jillian and Amy sat together, their hands clasped, both too frightened to speak. Every tick of the clock marked another second of survival. When Hughes finally rose to his feet, he spoke in that same quiet tone he used before each new decision. "Tomorrow," he said, "we move on." Then he turned down the lamp, leaving them in half-darkness. The last sound before sleep was the faint creak of the annex door and the whisper of wind pressing against the windows, as if the world itself held its breath. The next morning broke slowly, as if daylight itself hesitated to return to the house. Frost rimed the windows of Pottery Cottage in delicate, feathery webs, and the trees outside stood motionless beneath their frozen weight. Inside, the air was heavy with the stale scent of burned coal and unwashed clothes. The clock on the mantel ticked faintly, marking another day in a house that had slipped beyond time. Jillian awoke with the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the body. Her thoughts felt dulled, wrapped in a fog of disbelief. She could hear Hughes moving about downstairs, his footsteps even, almost unhurried. The routine he imposed had become strangely predictable. The demand for tea, the news on the radio, the small talk delivered in the tone of a man who believed himself civilized. That false normalcy was the most chilling thing of all. When she went to the kitchen, she found him seated at the table, reading the newspaper again. The story of his escape had grown longer. Journalists now speculated about his whereabouts, quoting anonymous police sources who believed he had crossed into Manchester or even fled toward Scotland. The press called him Mad Billy Hughes, a nickname he seemed to relish. He tapped the paper with his knuckle and smiled at Jillian. "You see," he said, "they've no idea where I am." Amy sat silently by the fire, her face drawn and gray. Her eyes darted between her captor and her daughter, searching for any sign of danger. She flinched each time Hughes stood up, each time he reached for his knife. Her voice, once warm and lively, had become a whisper that barely existed. Hughes told them he would leave that day. He needed food and supplies, he said, and the snow had eased enough to make travel possible. He wanted Jillian and Richard to drive him to Chesterfield. He spoke as if it were a casual errand, as though the last 48 hours had been nothing but a long winter visit. His composure made his words even more terrifying. Jillian nodded mechanically, her mind whirring through possibilities. If they could reach the town, there would be people, witnesses, perhaps police. Yet she knew he would never allow her to signal for help. He was too cautious, too perceptive. He seemed to read her thoughts before she could act on them. Hughes gave them a list: cigarettes, food, a small camping stove, a road map. His handwriting was neat, almost precise. He told Jillian to drive and Richard to accompany her. Amy would stay behind as assurance of their return. The word hostage was never spoken, but it hung in the air like smoke. Before they left, Hughes leaned close to Jillian. His breath was sour with tobacco. "Remember," he said softly, "their lives depend on you." The drive to Chesterfield felt unreal. The snow along the roadside had turned gray and heavy, pushed aside by plows. Sunlight reflected off the drifts, dazzling her eyes. The roads were quiet, though a few trucks moved cautiously along the main route. In the passenger seat, Richard sat rigid, staring straight ahead. Neither of them spoke. When they reached the town, Jillian parked near a small convenience shop. She entered alone, her pulse hammering in her ears. The smell of warm bread and paraffin heaters filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile fear that had consumed her for days. The clerk greeted her, cheerful and oblivious. She hesitated by the counter, clutching the list. Should she tell him? Could she? The words hovered on her tongue. "My family is being held hostage. There's a murderer in our house." But the image of her mother's face rose before her again, and fear closed her throat. She bought the supplies, thanked the man, and left. When she returned to the car, Richard looked at her with eyes full of silent accusation. He wanted her to act, to do something, but he also understood why she hadn't. There was no safety yet, only survival. The drive back felt longer. The snow began to fall again, fine and dry, drifting across the windshield in diagonal lines. The cottage appeared at last through the white blur, its roof gleaming with frost. Hughes was waiting at the gate. He opened the car door and inspected the bags. His smile was brief, but satisfied. "You did well," he said, repeating the words that had become his refrain. He carried the supplies into the house, moving with the self-assuredness of a man who believed himself untouchable. Inside, the air was cold despite the fire. Amy sat as they had left her, unmoving except for the faint tremor in her hands. Hughes told her they would be leaving soon, that freedom was close. He spoke as though the ordeal were nearly over, as though he had kept his promise not to hurt anyone. The layers of deception were so thick now that even he seemed to believe them. Evening came. Hughes grew restless again. He walked from room to room, muttering under his breath, checking the curtains and the locks. Jillian watched him carefully, sensing the shift in his mood. He had the look of a man cornered by his own imagination. He began packing. A few cans of food, cigarettes, a blanket, the knife, and the axe. The items went into a plastic bag that he slung over his shoulder. He told Jillian she would drive him away once it was dark. He said he would find another car further along the road. Then she could return and free her family. He said it kindly, almost reassuringly, as if granting her a favor. By nightfall, the wind had begun to rise again. The snow was lighter now, the flakes dancing in the headlamps as Jillian started the car. Hughes climbed into the passenger seat beside her, his bag at his feet, his knife within reach. Amy and Richard remained behind, tied and terrified, believing perhaps that the end was finally in sight. They drove for several minutes along the narrow lane that wound through the moor. The snow glowed faintly in the beams of the headlights, the sky black above it. Hughes said little. His breathing was steady, but his fingers tapped against his knee, betraying his agitation. Then suddenly he ordered her to turn back. Jillian froze. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He said he had forgotten the map. Without it, he could not find his way across the back roads. The explanation made no sense, yet he insisted. "Turn around," he said again, his tone sharper now. She obeyed, heart racing. The car rolled back down the lane, the tires crunching over the compacted snow. When they reached the cottage, Hughes told her to turn the vehicle so it faced the road, ready for a quick getaway. She did as she was told. Then he stepped out, closing the door softly behind him. Jillian waited in silence. The engine idled, its hum low and steady. Through the falling snow, she could see Hughes's shadow moving across the windows as he re-entered the house. A minute passed, then another. Somewhere inside, she heard a muffled sound, something sharp and brief, followed by the dull thud of movement. She didn't know what it meant, but dread flooded through her. Her hands clenched around the steering wheel. The front door opened. Hughes emerged, his face calm, his hands clean. He walked back to the car as though nothing had happened. He climbed in beside her and told her quietly, "We're leaving now." She tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered. It had stalled while idling. Hughes cursed under his breath, his composure cracking for the first time. "Go next door," he said. "Ask for help. Tell them the battery's dead." Jillian hesitated. He turned toward her, his expression hardening. "Now," he said. She opened the door and stepped out into the freezing air. The snow was falling harder again, the wind whipping it into her face. She could barely see the outline of the neighboring house. Each step toward it felt like walking a tightrope between salvation and doom. When she reached the door, she knocked once, then twice. It opened to reveal Len Newman, her neighbor, his face lined with concern. Behind him stood his wife, Joyce, in a dressing gown. Jillian's voice broke as she tried to speak. Words tumbled out, barely coherent. She told them about the man, about the knife, about the family held hostage. "For God's sake, help us," she whispered. Len froze for a moment, then nodded. "We'll call the police," he said. Jillian looked back toward her house. Through the snow, she could see the faint outline of the car still running in the drive, Hughes's figure barely visible inside. She turned back to the Newmans, her voice shaking. "Please hurry." Then she walked back toward the cottage, every step heavier than the last, knowing she was walking back into the dark heart of the storm. Jillian crossed the short stretch of frozen ground back to Pottery Cottage, with the snow biting at her face like 1,000 small needles. Her legs felt weak, her mind suspended between terror and a kind of grim calm. She had done what she could. The neighbors would call the police. Help was finally on its way. All she had to do now was survive long enough for them to arrive. The car still sat in the driveway, its exhaust fuming white against the night air. Hughes was waiting inside, the dim orange glow of the dashboard lighting his face. When she opened the door, he turned to her immediately. His eyes were narrow, suspicious, scanning her expression for any trace of deceit. "They'll be out in a moment," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "They're going to help start the car." He nodded slowly but said nothing. He looked back toward the neighboring house. The garage light had flicked on, and faint movement could be seen inside. For a few brief seconds, Jillian allowed herself to believe he was convinced. Then, across the still air, came the sound of an engine roaring to life. Not hers, but the Newman's car. Its tires spun for traction, then caught, propelling it down the road in the opposite direction. Hughes's head snapped toward the sound. He understood instantly. His expression changed from calm suspicion to furious certainty. The neighbors weren't coming to help. They were running. And that could mean only one thing. They had told someone. He let out a low, guttural sound. Not quite a shout, more like an animal growl. "They've betrayed me," he said softly, his voice trembling with rage. "You told them." Jillian's mouth opened, but no words came. He threw open the car door and stormed toward the house, his boots crunching over the snow. For a moment she remained frozen in place, paralyzed by the inevitability of what was coming. Then she saw movement by the front door, her mother, Amy, staggering outside. Her nightdress billowed in the wind, her arms reaching forward as though searching for help. "Amy!" Jillian cried, forgetting to call her Mum, forgetting everything except the sight of her stumbling across the snow. Hughes saw her too. He reached her in seconds. One arm went around her shoulders almost gently, then he pulled her out of sight, back toward the side of the house. Jillian heard the dull, rhythmic thuds that followed. No scream, just the sound of violence muffled by the storm. She could not move. Her legs refused to obey. The world seemed to contract around the sound. 1, 2, 3 blows, then silence. When Hughes returned, snow clung to his hair and coat. He was breathing heavily, though his expression was once again calm. Without a word, he opened the car door, pulled Jillian out by her arm, and told her they were leaving. She stumbled as he dragged her across the driveway. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Somewhere behind her, near the annex, she could see the faint outline of a shape lying half buried in the snow. She forced herself not to look too closely. They walked down the road, away from the cottage. Hughes moved quickly, almost dragging her beside him. Each time headlights appeared in the distance, he yanked her down into the ditch that ran alongside the lane, pressing her head into the freezing mud until the danger passed. His breath came fast and ragged, his mind consumed by the need to escape. To Jillian, the world had become a blur of white and darkness, of ice and fear. Her hands were numb, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. She tried to keep her steps steady to avoid provoking him. The weight of the knife glinted in his hand each time he turned. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small cluster of buildings, a farmhouse with lights still glowing in one window. Hughes hesitated. Then, with a shove, he pushed Jillian forward. "Knock," he said. Her knuckles rapped against the wooden door, 3 short knocks that seemed impossibly loud in the frozen silence. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man, stocky and weathered, with a mechanic's overalls still on. His name was Ronald Frost, though she would not learn it until later. "Sorry to trouble you," Jillian began, her voice trembling. "Our car's stuck. We can't get it started." Frost looked from her to the man standing just behind, half in shadow. Hughes's suit was rumpled, his shirt stained, but his voice, when he spoke, was calm and polite. "Evening," he said. "Just need a bit of help getting the engine going." Frost hesitated. There was something in the man's eyes that made him uneasy, but he said nothing. He nodded and reached for his coat. The 3 of them walked back down the road toward the car. The air was filled with the brittle crunch of boots on ice. At the driveway, the Chrysler stood idling weakly. Frost bent to check the engine, giving the starter a brief twist. It caught immediately. The car wasn't dead after all. It had simply been left too long. He turned back to Hughes. "There you are," he said. "Should be fine now." Hughes's smile was brief but genuine. "Much appreciated," he said, pressing a few coins into the man's hand. Frost waved it away. "Don't worry about it. Just be careful on these roads." He turned to leave, already thinking of the warmth of his fire. As Jillian climbed back into the car, she glanced at him one last time. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She wanted to scream, to tell him what was really happening, but the words refused to come. Then Hughes was in the driver's seat. The door slammed and the car lurched forward into the night. Frost stood for a moment in the falling snow, watching the taillights fade into the darkness. Something about the woman's face unsettled him. The way her eyes had looked both desperate and pleading. A knot of unease twisted in his stomach. When he reached home, he saw police cars gathering near the Newman's farm, their blue lights flashing against the snow. And suddenly he knew. By then it was already too late. The police reached Pottery Cottage minutes later. They found the front door ajar, the interior lit only by the dying fire. What they saw inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Arthur Minton's body was found in the annex, a teddy bear propped grotesquely on his chest. Sarah lay in her grandparents' bedroom, her small frame curled beneath a blanket, the radio still playing softly beside her. Richard Moran lay on the landing upstairs, face down in a pool of blood. And outside, half covered by snow near the gate, was Amy. Each body bore the marks of the same frenzied brutality. The violence had been personal, almost ritualistic. It spoke not of panic, but of rage. By the time the officer stepped back into the frozen air, Hughes and Jillian were already miles away. The first report went out over the radio just before 10 o'clock. Every available unit was mobilized. Roadblocks were set up across Derbyshire and into Cheshire. The fugitive was armed, dangerous, and now believed to have taken a hostage. In the car, Hughes drove erratically, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The road curved sharply through the moors, narrow and slick with ice. Jillian sat beside him, rigid with fear, watching the headlights sweep across the snow. Her mind replayed the last images she had seen: her mother's body, the darkness inside the house, the sound of footsteps behind her. She knew that everyone she loved was gone. The only thing left to do was survive long enough to make their deaths mean something. Far behind them, the lights of the police cars fanned out like a slow, relentless tide. The storm had ended, but the hunt had only just begun. The night was closing in, silent and merciless. Ahead lay the dark roads of the Peak District, and at the center of it all, one man's madness driving him toward an end he could no longer escape. The road curved away from the moors into a long descent toward the villages that marked the boundary of Derbyshire and Cheshire. The air outside had thinned to a bitter, metallic cold. Snow, once thick as fog, now glittered faintly on the verges beneath the car's headlights. Every few seconds, the tires lost traction, sliding half a foot before finding grip again. Hughes's hands clenched the wheel with the nervous energy of a man who could feel the world tightening around him. Beside him, Jillian sat perfectly still. The engine's hum filled the silence between them, but underneath it she could hear something else. His breathing, ragged and uneven, caught somewhere between fury and fatigue. She watched the reflection of his eyes in the side window. They never blinked. Each time a light appeared in the distance, his whole body stiffened. The man who had once seemed methodical was unraveling thread by thread. Behind them, far across the dark fields, the search had begun in earnest. Police convoys moved out from Chesterfield, Buxton, and Bakewell. The first radio reports of the slaughter at Pottery Cottage had spread like wildfire through the constabulary. The order was simple. Every road between Derbyshire and Cheshire was to be closed. The fugitive was armed, possibly accompanied by a surviving hostage. The word dangerous no longer seemed sufficient. Jillian knew none of this. Her world had shrunk to the narrow corridor of road illuminated by the car's twin beams. She focused on the rhythm of the windscreen wipers, back and forth, hypnotic in their steadiness. Each pass erased a layer of frost. Each pause allowed it to form again. She thought of her daughter's small hands, of how she used to trace circles on the fogged glass during car rides. The memory hit her with such force that she had to close her eyes to stop herself from crying. Hughes noticed. "Keep your eyes open," he said quietly. "If you see any lights ahead, tell me." His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something hollow in it now, as if he were talking to himself more than to her. He had killed 4 people in less than 2 days and still clung to the idea that this was an escape, not a spiral. His mind had built a small, fragile world in which he was still in control. That illusion was the only thing left keeping him from complete collapse. They passed through the small village of Baslow. The streets were deserted, each cottage window glowing faintly in the snowlight. Hughes slowed the car and turned off the headlights, coasting silently through the main road. He glanced at each house, scanning for movement. When none appeared, he switched the lights on again and accelerated. For miles they drove without seeing another vehicle. The moors gave way to forested slopes, and the road narrowed to a twisting ribbon of black ice. Hughes's thoughts spilled out in fragments, plans for escape, half-remembered names, resentment at the police who had forced him to do this. Jillian answered only when necessary. Her body ached from the tension of holding still, her hands raw from clenching the fabric of her coat. At one point, Hughes spoke of his daughter again. "Nicola will be grown up by now," he said. "They've probably turned her against me, told her I was a monster." He laughed once dryly. "Maybe I am." Jillian said nothing. He turned to look at her. "You think I'm mad, don't you?" She hesitated. "I think you're tired," she said softly. For a moment he seemed to consider that. His expression loosened, the hardness in his jaw fading slightly. "Tired," he repeated. "Yes, I've been running all my life." But the softness passed quickly. He leaned forward, peering into the darkness ahead. The engine growled as he pressed harder on the accelerator. The car fishtailed once, corrected, then straightened. "We'll find a safe place soon," he muttered. "Somewhere quiet, nobody will find us." Behind them, the first radio communication crackled through to the nearest roadblock. A constable at Baslow had reported a dark Chrysler moving west, driven by a man matching Hughes's description. Within minutes, units across 3 counties were rerouted. The pursuit spread like a net, slow at first but tightening with every mile. In the car, Jillian began to notice the change. Distant flashes of blue appeared intermittently behind them, reflections against the horizon of snow. Hughes saw them too. He tightened his grip on the wheel, muttering curses under his breath. "They're here," he said. "Already here." He slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car surged forward, engine whining in protest. The narrow lane became a blur of trees and white banks. The speed made the vehicle shudder, the chassis rattling with each bend. Jillian gripped the door handle, her stomach lurching as the headlights caught the sharp curve ahead. Somewhere behind them, a police radio operator spoke into his microphone. Suspect vehicle sighted on the A619 heading west, speeds exceeding 60. Armed suspect believed to have hostage in front seat. The officers who heard it tightened their seatbelts and checked their weapons. The order from the chief inspector was clear. No one was to take unnecessary risks, but few of them could forget the grisly details from the house they had just left. Every man in the convoy knew what kind of killer they were chasing. Hughes veered suddenly onto a side road, a rough rural track leading downhill. The car bounced violently over ruts, throwing Jillian against the door. She caught a glimpse of a signpost as they passed. Reno, 5 miles. The name meant nothing to her, but to the police who heard it on the radio minutes later, it would mark the place where the chase ended. As they descended, the snow turned to slush, spattering against the windshield. The headlights picked out low stone walls, hedgerows, and the occasional glint of frozen puddles. Hughes's movements grew erratic, jerky, impatient. He kept glancing in the mirror, muttering to himself about traps, about men waiting in the dark. The confidence that had sustained him was disintegrating. Jillian tried to speak, hoping to anchor him to something human. "You can stop," she said quietly. "It doesn't have to end badly." He looked at her with a strange, almost amused expression. "End badly?" he said. "It ended badly the day I was born." The road curved sharply left. Ahead, faint blue lights flickered through the trees. Hughes swore and swerved hard, the tires skidding across the icy surface. The car struck the embankment, bounced, and kept moving. The police had seen him now. The chase had become a matter of minutes. 2 patrol cars joined the pursuit, engines howling in the night. Orders were relayed through radios, overlapping voices merging into static. "Suspect armed, proceed with caution. Hostage still inside." Jillian could see the lights closing in behind them, reflections strobing against the glass. Hughes shouted incoherently, slamming the steering wheel. "They won't take me," he cried. "They'll never take me alive." The car hurtled through the village of Chapel-on-le-Frith, scattering the few bystanders who had ventured outside. Tires screeched, the engine roared, and for a brief moment Jillian thought it might all end there, in fire and metal. But Hughes kept control, barely. As they crossed into Cheshire, the police laid their final roadblock. 2 vehicles were parked across the main road near Reno, their lights flashing in the snow. Officers crouched behind them, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. They could hear the approach before they saw it, the rising wail of the engine, the squeal of tires. The Chrysler appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, skidding toward the barrier. One of the officers waved frantically for it to stop. It did not. Hughes swerved at the last second, clipping the corner of a police car and crashing into a low wall. The impact jolted Jillian forward against the dashboard. Steam hissed from the crushed bonnet. For a moment, there was silence. Then Hughes flung open his door, dragging Jillian with him. She stumbled, dazed as he pressed the blade against her neck. Police shouted from behind their cars, their voices echoing across the icy road. "Put down the weapon! Let her go!" Hughes shouted back, his words ragged with fury. "Get me another car! You hear me? Another car or I'll kill her right here!" The standoff had begun. The night that had swallowed the moor was now filled with floodlights and the heavy sound of men's breath in the cold. Somewhere among them was Chief Inspector Peter House, the man who would end it all. Jillian closed her eyes and waited for the inevitable. The roadblock at Reno was a cold tableau of light and silence. The narrow Cheshire lane glowed under the sharp glare of floodlights mounted on police cars. Snow glistened like glass shards across the tarmac, and the frozen hedges shimmered faintly in the beam of torches. The air was thin, brittle, and full of tension. The Chrysler sat at an angle against the stone wall, its front crumpled, its headlights shattered but still burning weakly. Steam hissed from the engine, curling upward into the dark. Inside the ruined vehicle, William Hughes and Gillian Moran were locked in a grotesque symmetry, his arm around her neck, his hand gripping the axe handle with the ease of long practice. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. Police officers had fanned out in a semicircle across the road, their boots crunching through the frost. Some crouched behind car doors, weapons trained on the Chrysler. Others knelt with radios pressed to their mouths, whispering updates to command. There was no sound but the wind, the soft hum of engines, and the faint drip of water from a broken radiator. Chief Inspector Peter House arrived within minutes. He stepped out of an unmarked vehicle and took in the scene with one steady glance. A broad-shouldered man in his 40s, House had the calm demeanor of someone used to chaos. Yet even he could feel the weight of this night, the knowledge that 4 lives were already gone, and one more hung in the balance. He moved to the front of the cordon, signaling for silence. "Hughes," he called out, his voice firm but controlled, carrying easily across the cold air. "This is Peter House. You're surrounded. No one wants anyone else hurt tonight." For a long moment, there was no response. Then the driver's door creaked open. Hughes stepped out, dragging Gillian with him. Her knees nearly buckled as he hauled her upright. The axe gleamed faintly in his right hand, the knife tucked into his coat pocket. "You want her alive?" Hughes shouted, his voice hoarse. "Then you'll get me a car, full tank, no tricks. I'm not going back to prison. I'll drive myself out of here, and when I'm clear, she walks away." House took a step forward, his gloved hands visible, palms open. "We can talk about that," he said. "Let her go first, and we'll find you a vehicle. We'll get you somewhere warm. You don't have to die out here." Hughes laughed sharply, the sound like breaking glass. "Warm?" he said. "You think I care about warm? I've been cold my whole bloody life." The wind rose suddenly, whipping loose snow across the road. The floodlights flickered in the gust. In the confusion of movement and light, Hughes pressed the blade closer to Gillian's throat. She flinched but didn't cry out. House held his ground. "If you hurt her, there's no way out," he said. "Think about your daughter. Nicola, isn't it? You want her to read in the paper that you killed another innocent woman." For a heartbeat, the name seemed to pierce the fog of Hughes's rage. His eyes darted toward House, uncertain, suspicious. "Don't you talk about her," he said quietly. House's tone softened. "You can still stop this. It's not too late." But Hughes shook his head. It was too late years ago. He turned to Gillian, his breath ragged. "Tell them I'm not a monster," he said. "Tell them I didn't mean for it to go like this." She didn't answer. She could feel his heart pounding through the arm that held her. It was not the rhythm of remorse, but of panic. The officers kept their distance, their rifles steady. Every one of them was aware of how easily this could end in disaster. In the glare of headlights and the rush of wind, time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. House tried again. "William, listen to me. I'm offering you my word. You let her go, and I'll drive you myself. No tricks. No violence." Hughes's eyes flicked toward him. For the first time, his expression changed. Not to trust, but to curiosity. "You," he said. "You'd drive me?" "Yes," House replied. "You and me. You can sit behind me with the knife if it helps you feel safe. I'll take you wherever you want." It was an extraordinary offer, but in that moment, it was all House could think to do. Hughes's paranoia thrived on betrayal. Perhaps directness could disarm it. The offer hung in the air like fragile glass. Gillian could feel the shift in Hughes's grip, the subtle loosening of tension. For the first time, she thought there might be a chance. But then one of the younger officers, stationed further down the road, shifted his position. The crunch of his boot on the ice echoed sharply through the silence. Hughes jerked, his attention snapping back to the movement. "That's it!" he shouted. "No one moves! You think I'm stupid? You think I don't see what's happening?" House raised his hands again. "No one's moving," he said quickly. "Look at me, William, just me." But Hughes was beyond reason now. His face was twisted with fury and fear. "You think I'll go back in chains?" he spat. "You think I'll rot in that cell while they laugh at me?" He raised the axe above Jillian's head. House acted without thought. He lunged forward, closing the distance in a burst of motion. His arm struck upward, deflecting the swing just enough that the blade caught Jillian across the forehead instead of cleaving her skull. She fell sideways, blood running down her face. The sound of the scuffle triggered a chain reaction. One of the armed officers positioned behind the nearest patrol car saw Hughes raise the weapon again. Through the swirling snow, it looked as if he were about to strike the fallen woman. A single shot cracked through the air. The bullet shattered the rear window of the Chrysler and grazed Hughes's temple. He staggered but did not fall. With a roar of rage, he swung the axe wildly, catching House's arm. The inspector cried out, the blade slicing through his coat and into the flesh beneath. "Hold your fire!" someone shouted, but it was too late. Another officer, Frank Peters, took aim through the open car door. He squeezed the trigger once, twice. The first bullet struck the doorframe. The second hit Hughes in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He dropped the axe, stumbled, and turned as if to reach for his knife. The third shot hit him squarely in the chest. For a moment he remained standing, eyes wide with shock, his breath misting in the cold. Then he collapsed onto the snow, the steam from his blood rising into the night air. House fell to his knees beside Jillian, pressing his uninjured arm against her wound. She was still conscious, her pulse rapid beneath his hand. "You're safe now," he told her, though his voice shook as he said it. Around them, the floodlights glowed against the snow, transforming the scene into something otherworldly. Figures moving slowly, voices muffled, the edges of reality softened by frost. An ambulance was called. Officers secured the perimeter. The snow continued to fall, light and silent, as if trying to cover what had happened. When Hughes's body was examined later, they found the knife still in his pocket, its handle slick with the residue of fingerprints and old blood. His face in death was strangely calm. The madness that had burned through him for days was gone, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had never truly understood himself. Jillian was taken to hospital, where her head wound was stitched and her condition stabilized. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind filled with fragments of sound, the crack of gunfire, the hiss of the wind, the voice of the inspector saying, "You're safe now." But safety, she knew even then, was not something she would ever truly feel again. Outside, as dawn approached, the police cars idled quietly, their lights fading against the pale horizon. Snowflakes drifted through the beams, falling onto the still figure of William Hughes, whose escape had finally come to its end. The moors lay silent once more. The night at Reno broke into morning slowly, the cold light creeping over the hills like a cautious intruder. When the first thin line of sun touched the snow-covered road, it revealed what was left of the chase. Tire tracks frozen into black ice, blood turning to rust where it had spilled, and the hushed figures of officers still standing in silence, their breath visible in the air. The storm had passed, but its ghost lingered, settled into every sound and movement like a weight that could not yet lift. Chief Inspector Peter House sat on the tailgate of a police van, his coat unbuttoned despite the chill. His right arm had been bandaged hastily by a paramedic, but he waved away further treatment. His face was pale, eyes glassy with fatigue. He stared down the road toward where Hughes's body had been covered with a tarp. Every few minutes his gaze drifted back to the ambulance that was now pulling away, carrying Jillian Moran toward the hospital in Macclesfield. When he had first seen her being treated, she had been sitting upright, dazed but alive, a line of dried blood down her temple. Her first question had not been about herself. "Is he dead?" she had asked. House had nodded once. She had exhaled a sound somewhere between a sob and a sigh. Not relief, not satisfaction, just the empty sound of an ending. Back at Pottery Cottage, the investigators worked through the morning and into the day. The snow around the house had turned pink where the blood had seeped beneath it. Inside, the air was heavy, saturated with the smell of smoke, wood polish, and decay. The fireplaces had gone cold, the remnants of burned logs lying in their own ash. Everything was quiet except for the soft shuffle of boots and the click of camera shutters. The crime scene officers moved carefully, noting every detail: the overturned teacups, the broken plastic ties, the dishes still laid on the table as though the family might return to finish their meal. On the walls hung photographs of happier times: family holidays, birthdays, a child's smile frozen forever at 10 years old. They looked out from those frames at the investigators like silent witnesses to the life that had once filled these rooms. The bodies had already been removed, carried away on stretchers under white sheets. But the traces of what had happened were everywhere. The marks on the floor, the blood that had soaked into the rugs, the faint metallic tang that no amount of disinfectant could erase. One officer, a veteran of 20 years, stepped outside to smoke and did not return for a long time. He later told his colleagues that it was the silence of the house that had gotten to him, the kind of silence that only exists in places where too many voices have been suddenly extinguished. By midday, reporters began to gather at the edge of the cordon. Word of the killings had spread through Derbyshire and beyond. Headlines that morning already carried fragments of the story. Escaped convict shot dead after hostage ordeal. 5 die in Peak District murder rampage. The names of the victims, Amy and Arthur Minton, Richard and Gillian Moran, and their daughter, Sarah, were printed in early drafts, though one name would later be struck out when Gillian was confirmed alive. The press spoke of Britain's year of the knife, of the growing unease over crime and punishment, of the cracks within a justice system that had allowed a violent offender to walk free with a blade hidden under his clothes. But for the people of Eastmoor, these words were abstractions. What they remembered were the faces, kind, ordinary people, whose only mistake had been to open a door. The official inquiry began within days. It was led by the Chief Inspector of Prisons, whose 70-page report would later become a grim study in institutional failure. The findings were clear and damning. The missing boning knife stolen from the prison kitchen had been reported but never found. The subsequent search of Hughes's cell had been cursory. The escort file, which should have classified him as violent, had been marked non-aggressive by mistake. That single administrative error meant no strip search, no secure transport, and no armed escort. The report listed each oversight with bureaucratic precision: the shortage of trained staff, the miscommunication between departments, the complacency of routine. It concluded with a recommendation that all prisoners transported for trial be subjected to full searches, and that security assessments be re-evaluated before every transfer. But for the families who had lost everything, the words on paper were meaningless. The system had failed not in theory, but in blood and bone. At the hospital, Gillian drifted between sleep and waking. When she opened her eyes, she saw the dull green of the curtains, the slow rhythm of the IV drip, and the faces of strangers, doctors, nurses, detectives, leaning over her with questions she could barely answer. Her memory of the previous 72 hours came in fragments: the sound of the axe, the smell of cigarette smoke, the feel of rope against her wrists. When Chief Inspector House visited her 2 days later, he stood awkwardly by her bedside. His arm was still in a sling, his face gray with lack of sleep. He thanked her for her courage, though the words felt insufficient. She nodded faintly. "Why?" she asked him after a long pause. Why did he have to kill them all? House hesitated. He had asked himself the same question countless times since that night. "Because he couldn't stop himself," he said finally. "Men like him don't know how to stop." Jillian looked away. "He could have just left," she whispered. "Yes," House said softly. "He could have." When he left her room, he paused in the corridor, staring at the floor. He'd been a police officer for 20 years, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this case, for the senselessness of it, the sheer scale of human ruin it had produced. The commendation he would later receive for bravery would feel hollow. The public would hail him as the man who stopped a murderer, but in his own mind, he would always remember himself as the man who arrived too late. Weeks passed. Snow melted from the fields, revealing the dark soil beneath, and with it the ordinary life of the countryside resumed. Children walking to school, farmers repairing fences, buses running their routes again. Yet Pottery Cottage remained empty, its windows shuttered, its garden unkempt. No one in Eastmoor could pass it without slowing down. The stories began almost immediately. Whispers of voices at night, of lights flickering behind the curtains. The locals said the house felt wrong, as if it had absorbed too much suffering to ever be ordinary again. When it finally went up for sale a year later, the estate agent's notice made no mention of what had happened inside. The price was low, but not low enough to erase memory. The first buyers walked away after a single viewing. The second stayed. They changed the name back to its 19th century title, North End Farm, removed the sign that bore the word pottery, and planted 2 oak trees at the edge of the drive. Over time, the grass grew back. But some stains, as the saying goes, are set too deep for the eye to see. In 1978, Jillian remarried quietly to Richard's stepbrother, Jim McQueen. They moved to another part of Derbyshire, far from the house that had defined her life. Their daughter was born the following year, and they named her Jane Sarah, a small gesture toward memory and mourning. For years afterward, Jillian avoided interviews. Only once, in a single newspaper article, did she speak publicly of the ordeal. "There's nothing left to say," she told the journalist. "He took everything already." The Pottery Cottage murders entered the annals of British crime, not merely as an act of violence, but as an emblem of systemic failure. The tragedy became a reference point for reform, cited in policy debates, in criminology lectures, in documentaries about the 1970s, a decade when faith in institutions was already fraying. But behind every statistic and headline remained the enduring truth of one woman's survival. For Jillian, survival was not victory. It was a sentence of remembering. Every winter thereafter, when snow fell thick over the moors, she would pause before the window of her home and watch the flakes drift down. The quiet beauty of it always carried a shadow, a reminder that once, long ago, snow had fallen just as softly, and had hidden something unspeakable beneath its perfect white silence. The year after the murders brought a kind of uneasy stillness to the Peak District. Villages returned to their daily routines, markets reopened, church bells resumed their Sunday rhythm, and hikers came once more to trace the ridges of the moors. Yet beneath the calm exterior, something invisible had shifted. The story of Pottery Cottage lingered in every conversation, in every mention of snow or solitude or sudden misfortune. It was not just a tale of horror, it had become a moral landscape, one through which the people of Derbyshire navigated their fears about the fragility of order and the unpredictable violence of the human mind. The newspapers moved on quickly, as they always do. Within weeks, William Hughes's name was displaced by newer tragedies, newer crimes. But in Eastmoor, his presence endured like a stain that refused to fade. To those who had lived nearby, it was impossible to forget that a man had walked across those very fields, his shoes sinking into the snow, carrying the weapon that would end 5 lives. Even years later, older residents would describe that week as if it were a single unbroken day. Gray sky, white ground, and a silence that stretched across the hills. For Jillian, that silence became the texture of her life. In the hospital, her recovery was slow. Physical wounds mended quickly. The deeper ones did not. She spoke little, even to those closest to her. At night, she dreamed of footsteps on gravel, of doors creaking open, of voices calling her name from another room. She would wake in the dark, uncertain whether she was still inside that cottage or somewhere else entirely. Psychiatrists would later write about her case in journals, the so-called Pottery Cottage survivor. They described her symptoms in careful clinical language: survivor's guilt, trauma-induced amnesia, hypervigilance. But their terminology could not capture the reality of what she endured. It was not just fear that haunted her, but the unbearable contradiction of being alive when everyone she loved was gone. She left the hospital that spring and moved in temporarily with friends near Matlock. She avoided public attention, refusing interviews and declining to appear in court when the inquest into Hughes's death was held. "There's nothing more I can say," she told the coroner's officer through tears. The jury ruled it justifiable homicide. The phrase was precise, correct. Yet to Jillian it felt painfully hollow. There had been nothing justifiable about any of it. The funeral for her family took place on a bright day in March. The churchyard was damp with thawed snow, the ground soft beneath the mourners' feet. The coffins, small, plain, and identical, were arranged in a row. Neighbors came, as did officers from the Derbyshire Constabulary. Chief Inspector House attended quietly, standing at the back. When the service ended, he lingered for a long time after everyone had gone, staring at the gravestones until the sun dipped below the trees. In his report to headquarters, he described the case as the most devastating and tragic incident in my 20 years of service. He never spoke publicly about it again. Those who knew him said it changed him. He became withdrawn, slower to laugh, more deliberate in his judgments. When he was later awarded the Queen's Commendation for bravery, he accepted it without ceremony and stored the medal in a drawer. Years later, he would tell a colleague, "We call it courage, when really it's just desperation, doing something because you can't stand to do nothing." Across England, the Pottery Cottage case fed into a growing unease about crime, punishment, and the failures of rehabilitation. The 1970s were a decade of cynicism, a time when faith in authority was eroding under the weight of economic stagnation, strikes, and political scandal. Hughes's story fit too neatly into the public mood. A violent man released too soon, ignored by a careless system, destroying everything he touched. Newspapers framed him as a symbol of moral decay, the inevitable product of a society losing its way. Yet the truth was more complicated. Hughes had not been born a monster. He had been shaped by neglect, instability, and humiliation. His early records, examined in the inquiry, revealed a child of transient homes, broken schooling, and constant reprimand. Teachers called him restless, impulsive, unteachable. Juvenile detention hardened him further. Every institution that might have helped him instead confirmed his alienation. By adulthood, he had learned one lesson only: that control could be taken by force when it could not be earned by respect. But even understanding his history offered no comfort. For Jillian, the only question that mattered, why them, had no answer. Hughes had chosen her family not because of who they were, but because they had been nearest to his path. Their decency had doomed them. She often thought about that, how their kindness had opened the door that should have remained locked. In the months following the tragedy, letters of sympathy arrived from across Britain. Strangers wrote to tell her that they prayed for her, that they wept when they read her story, that she was an inspiration. She read none of them. They piled up unopened in a drawer until one day she burned them all in the fireplace. She did not want to be anyone's symbol. When she finally moved into her new home with Jim McQueen, it was a modest stone cottage overlooking fields of heather. She planted lilacs along the fence and filled the rooms with quiet things: books, small lamps, a single-framed photograph of Sarah smiling by the sea. Her new husband never asked for details about what had happened. He understood that silence was not avoidance, but survival. Still, the memories had a way of returning uninvited. Sometimes, when the wind howled across the moors at night, she would hear it as footsteps on snow. Once, during a winter storm, she found herself standing at the window, heart pounding, convinced she saw a shadow move by the gate. When she opened the door, there was nothing there but falling snow. She learned to live with the echoes. She tended the garden, took long walks, raised her daughter. She did not speak of the past, even to her child. When Jane grew old enough to ask about the scar on her mother's forehead, Gillian told her it was from a car accident. The lie was easier than the truth. In later years, when documentaries and books revisited the Pottery Cottage murders, journalists tried to find her. They left messages, letters, offers of payment. She refused them all. The story, she believed, belonged to the dead, not to those who had survived. As time passed, the case slipped from the front pages into the quiet archives of British crime history. Scholars studied it. Criminologists cited it, but the living wound of it faded. The house at Eastmoor changed owners several times. Its walls were repainted, its name restored to North End Farm, its garden replanted. Children played in the fields again, and the new occupants rarely spoke of what had happened there. Yet the land remembers. On winter nights, when the fog rolls in from the hills and the air carries that peculiar stillness before snow, the village feels momentarily caught in 1977 again, as though time itself pauses to replay the sound of a distant knock on a wooden door, and the world before the storm holds its breath. The Pottery Cottage murders did not just end lives, they fractured a sense of safety that had defined rural England. In their quiet grief, people began to question how such evil could slip unnoticed into their midst. The case became not only a story of one man's madness, but a mirror reflecting what happens when institutions fail and decency is left undefended. For Gillian, the lesson was simpler, crueler, and more personal, that evil does not arrive with warning. It enters softly, asking for warmth and tea on a winter's day. In the years following the Pottery Cottage murders, official Britain moved to tidy up the story. Committees were formed, reports drafted, policies rewritten. The machinery of accountability began to turn, slow and methodical, its purpose less to heal than to preserve the illusion that something could be learned from the wreckage. But the deeper truth was one that no white paper could express. The system that failed the Moran family had not malfunctioned. It had functioned exactly as it was built, efficient in its paperwork, indifferent in its humanity. The inquiry led by the Chief Inspector of Prisons concluded in May 1977. It detailed a sequence of missed warnings so banal they felt inevitable. An unchecked inventory sheet, a kitchen supervisor too overworked to log the disappearance of a knife, a prison officer who saw Hughes's temper but lacked the authority to change his risk classification. Each of these moments was small, almost invisible, yet together they formed the lattice through which one violent man slipped into the world. The report recommended tighter searches and new escort procedures. Parliament debated the issue briefly, then turned to other matters. The press, for their part, tried to make sense of the human cost. The Times called it a tragedy born of administrative fatigue. The Daily Mail was blunter, branding it an execution of innocence. For a few months, the case dominated headlines, a symbol of what was wrong with the penal system, a bureaucracy too lenient on men who had long abandoned the idea of reform. But beneath the fury lay something more complex and less convenient. Hughes's trajectory was not merely the product of mismanagement. It reflected the way Britain treated its poor, its angry, its broken. He had grown up in a country that preached discipline but rarely offered compassion. A boy shuffled through schools and detention centers that mistook punishment for guidance. His early report spoke of a child incapable of self-control, a phrase that echoed later in the psychiatric notes written during his prison term. The institutions agreed on their diagnosis, but disagreed on what to do about it. They locked him up, released him, locked him up again, and called it progress. Hughes's life was a loop. Theft, Arrest, violence, confinement, release. Each repetition hardened him further. By the time he entered HMP Leicester in 1976, he was no longer simply dangerous. He was desensitized. The violence he inflicted on the Moran family did not erupt suddenly. It had been rehearsed, refined, and normalized through years of institutional neglect. He was a product, not an aberration. Criminologists who revisited the case in the 1980s argued that Hughes's pathology was not unique, but emblematic of a wider problem: the failure to recognize chronic violence as a symptom of psychological collapse rather than defiance. One academic, writing for the British Journal of Criminology, described him as a man whose brutality was inseparable from his learned helplessness. It was a neat phrase, but in the small towns of Derbyshire, it explained nothing. The people there did not need theory. They needed to believe the system could keep them safe. In that sense, Pottery Cottage became a national myth, a story told not to understand, but to reassure. The moral was simple. Vigilance must be improved, officers must be trained, procedures must be followed. Yet the myth left out the uncomfortable question of empathy. Who, after all, had ever tried to see the world through Hughes's fractured mind before it was too late? Gillian, still living quietly in the countryside, paid no attention to these debates. She read no papers, watched no reports. The very word Hughes had become unbearable to her, a sound that carried with it the echo of her family's last breath. But she could not avoid the changes that rippled outward from the case. Every few months she received a letter from the police or a lawyer informing her of new regulations or appeals related to the inquest. Each time she signed her name on the reply and returned it without comment. Bureaucracy had become the final ritual of her grief. In 1978, when she married Jim McQueen, the ceremony was deliberately small. A registrar, 2 witnesses, and silence. No church, no flowers, no photographs. The newspapers learned of it only weeks later and printed it beneath the headline, "Survivor of Pottery Cottage finds love again." Gillian never forgave them for that phrase. Love, she thought, was too soft a word for what had brought her and Jim together. It was not love that sustained them, but understanding. 2 people accepting that some wounds do not close, only stop bleeding. While the country debated criminal reform, Gillian learned to live with the ordinary again. She cooked, gardened, walked to the village post office each morning. To the casual observer, she was simply another middle-aged woman living a quiet life in the English countryside. But there were moments when the facade cracked. A sudden noise, a slamming door, a raised voice would send her retreating into silence for hours. When she saw a man with a particular tilt of his head or the same restless energy in his gait, her body froze. Her neighbors never asked questions. They respected her privacy with a politeness born of both sympathy and fear. To them, she was the living reminder of how fragile normality could be. Meanwhile, at the Ministry of Justice, the recommendations from the Hughes Inquiry slowly filtered into practice. By 1978, all prisoner transfers required a mandatory strip search, a policy that would later be cited as a cornerstone of modern custodial security. The change was hailed as progress, though few acknowledged that it had been purchased at the cost of 5 lives. Chief Inspector House, promoted and then quietly retired, withdrew to the coast. He spent his final years in a small seaside town, fishing in the early mornings and rarely speaking of his past. When he died in 1992, his obituary in the Derbyshire Times mentioned his commendation, but not the case that had earned it. Those who knew him said he carried the ghosts of that night with him always. The woman's face, the sound of gunfire, the weight of knowing that heroism had come too late. In Eastmoor, Pottery Cottage, now North End Farm, continued its quiet transformation. The new owners replaced the floors, rebuilt the fireplace, and planted thick hedges for privacy. Visitors described it as peaceful, though locals whispered otherwise. Some said the house still carried a presence, a feeling that grew stronger in winter. Others dismissed such talk as superstition. But every December, when the first frost appeared, someone would leave a small bouquet of flowers at the edge of the gate. No one knew who. By the late 1990s, the case had faded from living memory, preserved mainly in archives and the occasional true crime anthology. Yet its influence endured in subtler ways, in the caution of prison officers who now searched a little more thoroughly, in the tone of voice used by judges when granting bail, in the quiet mistrust that ordinary citizens carried toward strangers who knocked on their doors after dark. The Pottery Cottage murders had changed not only procedures, but psychology. They had taught a country that prided itself on restraint to glimpse, just briefly, the chaos beneath. The comforting belief that violence belonged to cities and strangers had been shattered. In its place remained the uneasy truth that cruelty could emerge anywhere, even on a snowy hill in Derbyshire, in a house warmed by a family fire. For Gillian, that truth was not philosophical, but deeply personal. She understood, in a way no one else could, how thin the line was between safety and catastrophe. It was a lesson that lived in her blood, resurfacing each winter when the air grew still and the sky turned white. She would stand at her window, the reflection of her face merging with the snow outside, and remember the words Hughes had once spoken to her. It's a day very much like today. Some memories, she knew, were not meant to fade. They remained as warnings, as scars, as quiet monuments to what happens when the human systems built to protect instead look away. Time, in its quiet and indifferent way, began to gather distance between the present and that January of 1977. The snow that had once blanketed the moors melted, froze again, melted once more, until the seasons blurred into each other and the story of Pottery Cottage became something told in softened tones. It was the kind of story that no one wanted to remember, but no one dared to forget. By the 1980s, the case had become part of the country's shared folklore of tragedy. Not quite history, not yet myth. For journalists and criminologists, it was an emblem of bureaucratic complacency. For the people of Derbyshire, it remained a wound that healed only in appearance. The image of that stone house, isolated, snowbound, a fire burning inside while death moved room to room, lingered in the imagination. It symbolized something that could not be legislated away, how swiftly the ordinary can turn to horror when systems fail and compassion falters. At the national level, debates about crime and punishment hardened. The political mood had shifted. Leniency was now regarded as weakness. In Parliament, ministers spoke of restoring public confidence through stricter sentencing and tougher enforcement. Few mentioned the lessons of Pottery Cottage except to use them as evidence of the need for severity. But behind those speeches lay a contradiction. Hughes had not escaped because of mercy. He had escaped because of indifference. Because too many people had done their jobs by habit rather than by care. The prison reforms of the late 1970s and early 1980s brought new procedures, but not necessarily new attitudes. Officers became more vigilant, but also more fearful. The relationship between prisoner and guard, once paternalistic, if often cruel, grew increasingly adversarial. The prison was no longer a place for imagined redemption, only containment. And while officials congratulated themselves on preventing another Hughes, they did little to address the world that had produced him in the first place. Among those who still spoke of the case, a strange duality persisted. To some, Hughes was a monster, a creature beyond comprehension, a shadow cast by evil itself. To others, he was a cautionary tale about what happens when poverty, violence, and neglect converge upon a single life. The sociologists of the time argued that he embodied a generation of working-class men crushed between economic decline and social isolation. He had grown up in the post-war years of supposed prosperity, but lived in its margins, a world of casual labor, small crimes, and endless disappointments. It was tempting to see him as a symbol, but to Gillian, he remained only a face. The eyes that had watched her across the room, the voice that had lied with such ease. She had no interest in explanations. Evil, she knew, did not require context to be real. It needed only opportunity. By 1981, she and Jim had settled into a rhythm of quiet domesticity. Their daughter, Jane, was 2 years old, a child of laughter and impossible energy. Watching her play sometimes filled Jillian with an almost unbearable tenderness, and with it, a fear she could not voice. She checked the locks at night, not once but twice. She kept a light burning in the hallway even when her husband protested about the cost of electricity. She avoided certain roads in winter, unwilling to drive where snow obscured the edges of the land. She rarely spoke of what had happened, yet its imprint was visible in the way she moved through the world. Her voice, once clear and confident, had softened. Her hands trembled when she heard the whine of an engine outside the house. When local papers occasionally revisited the Pottery Cottage murders, she would close the curtains and sit in silence until the unease passed. For those who lived through the aftermath, the case became a prism through which broader anxieties about class and safety refracted. In the pubs and cafes of the Peak District, people spoke not only of Hughes, but of what his existence revealed, that the walls separating order from chaos were thinner than anyone wished to believe. Farmers began locking their sheds at night. Shopkeepers installed stronger bolts on their doors. The illusion of rural innocence had been punctured. Meanwhile, a new generation of officers entered the police force, trained in the lessons written in blood on that winter's page. Among them were men who had grown up hearing their fathers talk about Mad Billy Hughes, the convict who brought death to a village. To them, the story was not history, but warning. Every arrest, every transport carried the echo of that caution. Check the restraints. Search the prisoner again. Never assume. The official language of reform became impersonal. Security protocols, risk management, procedural compliance. Yet beneath it lay an unspoken fear that the state, despite its power, could not predict the moment when a man might turn feral. The Pottery Cottage murders had shown that violence did not always arrive with a plan. Sometimes it emerged from a single decision: to trust, to unlock, to look away. In universities, criminologists began re-examining the moral questions of punishment. Could rehabilitation exist in a system designed to dehumanize? Could accountability coexist with empathy? Papers were written, seminars held, and debates staged, but outside the lecture halls, little changed. The prisons grew more crowded, their walls higher, their guards more cautious. England, it seemed, had decided that safety meant isolation. For Jillian, isolation was not policy, but instinct. She found solace in routine, in the rhythm of housework, the warmth of her child's small hand, the predictable cycle of seasons. Each morning she walked the narrow path through the fields behind her cottage, where frost glistened on the grass and the air carried the scent of wood smoke. To anyone watching, she looked serene, but the landscape she loved was also the one that haunted her. The hills, the snow, the quiet. They all carried traces of the world she had once tried to survive. On the 10th anniversary of the murders, a journalist tracked her down. He was young, polite, and nervous, clearly sent by an editor too ambitious to care about decency. He arrived uninvited, carrying a notebook and a tape recorder. When she opened the door, he introduced himself and began to explain his project, a retrospective on the tragedy, its impact on law and community. Jillian listened for a moment, then said only, "There's nothing new to tell." Before closing the door, she added quietly, "Some stories should stay buried." The article never appeared, though rumors of her refusal circulated briefly in the local press. For a few weeks, neighbors stopped by to ask if she was all right. She said she was. In truth, she had long since accepted that the world would keep retelling her pain, reshaping it to suit its need for narrative. What she had lived, others would consume as cautionary tale. Years later, when true crime television turned its gaze to the 1970s, Pottery Cottage returned to the screen. Grainy photographs of snow, police cordons, and Hughes's mugshot flickered across the frame. a narrator spoke of one of Britain's most chilling domestic tragedies. The tone was measured, respectful even, but to those who remembered, it felt like intrusion. In her living room, Gillian sat watching the program unfold, not out of curiosity, but because her daughter, now grown, wanted to understand the story she had never been told. The narrator's voice described the event step by step, factual but distant, as if pain could be catalogued. When it ended, Jane turned to her mother with wide eyes. "Was it really like that?" she asked softly. Gillian looked at the screen for a long time before replying. "No," she said. "It was worse." The room fell silent. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of winter's return. For Gillian, the past was not gone. It was simply quieter now, woven into the landscape, a part of the hills, the roads, and the snow that fell each year. The system had moved on. The papers had yellowed, but she knew what they all forgot. Justice, when it came, had not restored anything. It had only ended one man's story, leaving hers to go on. By the turn of the 1990s, the Pottery Cottage murders had drifted from public memory into the muted space reserved for old crimes. Neither forgotten nor fully alive, a story recalled only when snow began to fall thick on the moors, and someone mentioned how silence can turn men mad. Time had wrapped the event in distance, softening the horror but not erasing its outline. In Derbyshire, people spoke of it the way they might speak of a long winter. Dreadful, survived, and best left behind. For Gillian, those years passed not as healing, but as endurance. The press no longer called, and she was grateful. She worked part-time at a library in Bakewell, shelving books quietly in the long afternoons. She liked the stillness there, the way sound seemed to vanish beneath the high ceilings, and how people whispered by habit, even when no one else was near. It was a place where the past could rest, among the dust and muted colors of other people's words. Her daughter, Jane, grew into adolescence with the kind of brightness that seemed to repel the dark. She loved animals, music, and long walks across the same hills that her mother had once avoided. Sometimes Gillian would watch her from a distance, standing where the land began to rise, the girl's figure outlined against the clouds. That sight brought her an ache that was part love, part fear. The quiet dread that safety was only ever temporary, that life's calm could shatter again without warning. Gillian rarely spoke of the family she had lost. Her memories of Richard, of her parents, of Sarah, her first daughter, existed in sealed compartments that she could open only in solitude. The world outside had no language for that kind of grief. When she visited the cemetery, she went alone, early in the morning before the mist lifted. She cleaned the headstones, left fresh flowers, and traced her fingers over the carved names. Each time she did, she felt the same thoughts settle inside her. Survival had not been a gift, but a debt she would never finish paying. In the wider world, Britain was changing. The country had grown harder, more skeptical, more wary of sentiment. Thatcher's decade had redefined notions of responsibility and punishment. The welfare state shrank, prisons filled, and the rhetoric of law and order became sharper, almost punitive. In that atmosphere, the story of Hughes resurfaced occasionally, cited in policy papers or crime retrospectives as evidence of what leniency could cost. Few remembered the nuances of the case. The moral had been simplified. A dangerous man had been trusted, and innocent people had died. But to those who had lived through it, that explanation felt too convenient. Hughes's violence had been monstrous, but it had not been born in isolation. It had grown in the cracks between neglect and pride, between bureaucracy and empathy. It was easier to call him evil than to admit the systems that contained him had been hollow for years. Academics began writing about the cultural memory of crime, how certain tragedies become symbols while others fade. Pottery Cottage, they said, revealed Britain's ambivalence toward compassion, its instinct to sympathize with victims, yet resist examining why such victims exist. Each article returned to the same paradox. Hughes was both exceptional and inevitable, an individual aberration and a mirror of structural failure. None of this reached Gillian. The world of analysis and debate was as remote from her life as another country. She lived quietly, measuring her days by the ordinary rituals that kept her anchored. She took tea at the same hour, read before bed, and rarely left home after dark. In time, she found a rhythm that resembled peace, though peace, to her, meant little more than the absence of panic. In the early 90s, when the television dramatization of the murders was announced, she received a polite letter from the producers asking for her input. They wrote of accuracy, sensitivity, and public interest. She read the letter once and tore it in half. The thought of actors standing in her old kitchen, reciting lines written to mimic terror, felt like a second violation. She had survived reality. She refused to lend it to fiction. When the program aired months later, she did not watch. Friends told her afterward that it had been tastefully done. The phrase meant nothing. You cannot render slaughter tasteful, she thought. You can only make it distant. That same year, Chief Inspector Peter House died quietly by the sea. His obituary described him as a decorated officer with a distinguished career. There was no mention of the night at Reno, no note of the scar on his arm, or the insomnia that had plagued him for years. Gillian learned of his death through a clipping someone mailed her. She stared at the short paragraph for a long time, then folded it neatly and placed it between the pages of a book she never finished reading. As the years passed, Jane left for university, and the house grew quieter still. The evenings stretched long, filled with the small sounds of domestic solitude, the tick of the clock, the sigh of the wind under the door. Gillian's world had contracted to what she could see from her window, the line of the hills, the shifting light, the occasional figure of a walker passing by. She found comfort in their anonymity. They were reminders that life went on for others, even when it had stopped for her. Sometimes, when snow began to fall, she would light a candle instead of switching on the lamp. She would sit by the window, watching the flakes drift down and disappear into the ground. The sight filled her with both dread and calm, dread for what snow once brought, calm for what it now concealed. The quietness of snowfall had always seemed to her like a trick of nature, beauty masking the slow suffocation of everything beneath. In those moments, she often thought of Sarah. She tried not to imagine her daughter's final minutes, but memory is not obedient. It returns when it chooses, uninvited and vivid. She would see flashes, the child's bright scarf, the sound of laughter that once filled the garden, the feel of small hands pressed against her own. And then, inevitably, she would hear the silence that had replaced them. She had never spoken publicly of that silence, but it was the center of her life. She carried it like a second skin, invisible but constant. People called her brave. She thought of herself as merely functional. Survival, she knew, was not courage. It was endurance, and endurance is often indistinguishable from resignation. By the early 2000s, the world had changed again. Crime television, once a niche genre, had become a kind of national pastime. The true crime boom brought with it a new fascination for stories like hers, told in soft-voiced documentaries with somber music and aerial shots of misty fields. Each episode ended the same way, with lessons learned, justice served, closure achieved. Closures. The word appeared everywhere, yet it meant nothing to her. There could be no closure where love had been torn out by the root. There was only the quiet passage of time, a slow drifting away from the intensity of pain until it became a dull, familiar ache. In her later years, Gillian found herself less haunted by fear than by reflection. She no longer asked why it had happened or what might have changed if someone had acted differently. Those questions had no answers. Instead, she wondered about the shape of kindness, how easily it can be turned against those who offer it. Her family had opened their door to a stranger out of decency, and it had destroyed them. Yet she could never bring herself to regret that impulse. To regret it would be to renounce what made them human. One winter evening, decades after the murders, she walked through her garden at dusk. Snow had begun to fall again, thin and almost gentle. The air smelled of cold earth and smoke from distant chimneys. She stopped at the end of the path and looked toward the hills. In the half-light, they seemed endless. It struck her then how strange memory is, how it can hold both terror and beauty in the same frame. The snow that had once covered her family's graves now lay across the fields like a shroud and a blessing. The same silence that had terrified her now felt like peace. And as the first darkness of night settled, Jillian did something she had not done in years. She whispered her daughter's name aloud, not in grief, but in recognition. The sound rose softly into the still air, dissolving into the white hush of the falling snow. Winter returned each year with its familiar ceremony. The slow shortening of days, the first rim of frost on the fields, the familiar ache that settled behind Jillian's ribs as the air grew still. The decades had softened the immediacy of her grief, but never its presence. The mind does not heal from such a wound. It simply learns to move around it, like a tree growing around the scar of a lightning strike. By the 2010s, Jillian had grown old in that quiet corner of Derbyshire. Her hair, once dark, was now a soft silver that caught the cold light. She lived alone in the same cottage she and Jim had bought after the tragedy, a house of low beams and uneven floors that smelled faintly of wood smoke even in summer. Jim had died years earlier, a heart attack one morning while tending to the garden, and their daughter had moved south, first to London, then abroad. Letters came often, phone calls less so. Jillian did not mind. She had made her peace with solitude. It was the only kind of company she truly trusted. The hills around her house were much the same as they had been when she first came to them, quiet, watchful, untamed. In winter, the fields turned to a pale silver, and the trees stood like dark sentinels against the sky. The moors were empty again, just as they had been that day long ago. The land had forgotten nothing. It carried its memory not in monuments or headlines, but in the air itself, in the way silence deepened after snowfall, in the strange, heavy calm before dawn. Each year when the anniversary came, Jillian performed the same ritual. She rose early before the light, made tea, and walked to the window that faced north. Beyond it, the land descended gently toward the valley. Sometimes mist pooled there like a body of water. She would stand for a few minutes, her fingers pressed against the cold glass, and think of the people buried beneath that same earth. Her mother, her father, her husband, her daughter. She no longer cried. She had run out of tears decades earlier. Now there was only quiet remembrance and the faint comfort of continuity. The newspapers no longer marked the date. The story had receded fully into history, absorbed into the long catalogue of British crimes. New tragedies had come to occupy public attention. But occasionally, during the darker months, local historians or podcasters would rediscover it. The Pottery Cottage murders, as they always called it, using the name she still refused to say aloud. The retellings followed the same pattern: the snow, the escape, the violence, the chase, the gunfire. It was all accurate enough, yet each version seemed further from the truth. She knew why people kept returning to it. The story contained everything that drew the imagination: horror, isolation, the moral clarity of evil confronted by law. But none of them understood what truly made it terrible. It wasn't the blood or the violence. It was the stillness, that unbearable suspension of time when the ordinary had turned irrevocably wrong. Sometimes when the village was quiet and the wind came from the north, she thought she could almost hear it again. The faint hum of the radio, the creak of the stairs, the sound of footsteps pacing above her head. Not memories exactly, but echoes. the kind that the landscape itself seems to hold. She had returned to Eastmoor only once, years earlier, driven by a mixture of compulsion and disbelief. The house was still there, though almost unrecognizable. The new owners had rebuilt much of it, adding extensions and new windows. The garden was neat, the hedges trimmed, the gate freshly painted. A dog barked as she stood by the road, staring at the stone walls that had once been splattered with snow and blood. A woman opened the door and smiled politely, assuming she was lost. Jillian said nothing. She turned back toward the car, leaving the past to its new inhabitants. It was a strange comfort to see life restored to that place. People cooking, laughing, hanging laundry in the same yard that had once been a crime scene. It proved that even the darkest soil could grow light again. Yet as she drove away, she realized that memory has its own geography. No matter how much the land changes, the mind continues to see it as it was. In later years, historians began to describe the case as a turning point in British policing, the moment when human error forced systemic reform. That phrase, human error, appeared in nearly every retrospective. To Jillian, it sounded too small. Error implied carelessness, not catastrophe. What had failed in 1977 was not diligence but empathy, the ability to imagine how fragile safety really was. She read one of those articles once, sent by her daughter, who thought she might find it interesting. It was printed in a journal, written by a criminologist who had not been born when the murders happened. He described Hughes as a product of institutional neglect and cyclical violence. His analysis was precise, almost elegant, but when she reached the paragraph that mentioned her family, the Moran household comprising 5 members, 4 of whom were killed, she closed the journal and set it aside. To her, the language of sociology stripped away everything that mattered. Her loved ones had not been household members. They had been people, with laughter and tenderness and ordinary dreams. One night, as she sat by the fire, she found herself remembering a small detail from those days. The smell of soap on her mother's hands, the sound of her father's whistle when he fed the birds, Sarah's giggle echoing down the hallway. The memories arrived not as pain, but as warmth, faint and human. For the first time, she felt that perhaps remembering them this way, not as victims but as themselves, was the truest form of justice. Outside, the first snow of the year began to fall. It came softly, the flakes drifting sideways in the wind. The sight filled her with a strange calm. There was no fear now, only reverence. Snow no longer meant death. It meant continuity, the cycle of stillness and renewal that the land had always known. She thought about how landscapes carry stories, even when people forget them. The hills and the moors had witnessed everything. The footsteps of the fugitive, the searchers with dogs and lanterns, the smoke from the burning cottage fires that winter. Over the decades, rain had washed away the blood, grass had grown over the tracks, but the memory lingered in the air like a low hum beneath the wind. The land remembers differently from people. It absorbs rather than retells. That thought brought her comfort. If memory could live in the landscape, then her family was not gone, only diffused, part of the soil, the sky, the frost that settled each year. She began to think of the earth as a kind of witness, the only one that never forgets and never embellishes. In the final years of her life, she walked slower but still made her way to the fields when the weather allowed. The locals recognized her but rarely spoke of who she was. In a small village, silence can be a kind of respect. They saw her as a quiet, dignified woman with kind eyes and a soft voice, unaware that she carried an entire era inside her. On her last winter, when she was too frail to walk far, she asked her daughter to drive her through the moors one final time. The snow was falling then, too, gentle, almost ceremonial. As the car wound along the road, the world outside seemed unchanged. The same stone walls, the same skeletal trees, the same endless expanse of white. "Do you think it ever forgets?" Jane asked softly. Her mother smiled faintly. "No," she said, "but it forgives." Neither spoke again for the rest of the drive. The car moved steadily through the silence, the tires whispering over the snow. The following spring, Jillian passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her ashes were scattered across the moorland she had once feared to see. The wind carried them wide and far, mingling them with the soil of the place that had witnessed both her terror and her endurance. And when winter came again, as it always did, the snow fell over that ground once more, soft, patient, indifferent. The land accepted it all, the tragedy, the memory, and the small, persistent grace of survival. After Jillian's death, the moors carried on in their quiet rhythm. Seasons shifted, the heather bloomed and withered, and the sky over Derbyshire remained its habitual gray. The story of Pottery Cottage might have ended with her had it not been for the persistence of memory, the way certain tragedies refuse to stay buried, resurfacing in the collective imagination long after their witnesses are gone. Her daughter, Jane, returned to Derbyshire that spring to settle her mother's affairs. The house was still and tidy, almost untouched since the last time she had visited. Dust clung to the window panes, and a faint scent of lavender lingered in the hall. On the mantelpiece stood the familiar framed photograph, a seaside snapshot of a young family, a man squinting into the sun, a woman smiling shyly, and two girls laughing between them. The image, slightly faded now, seemed to contain two different eras, one that had been lost and one that had endured. Jane spent several days sorting through the house, discovering fragments of a life lived in careful restraint. There were old gardening gloves folded neatly by the door, books on local history with penciled notes in the margins, and boxes of letters her mother had kept but never answered. In the back of a drawer, she found a worn, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled not with full sentences, but with single lines, fragments of memory. The smell of wet wool, the color of morning light, a name repeated like a prayer. Reading them, Jane realized how much her mother had carried in silence. She had grown up knowing the outline of the tragedy, but never its texture. Her mother had been protective, perhaps mercifully so. Only as an adult did Jane begin to understand the depth of what Jillian had endured, the details she learned not from her mother, but from archives and strangers, from the world's retellings rather than from the person who had lived it. And now, standing in that quiet house, she felt a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. Her mother had given her a childhood untouched by horror, even as she bore the full weight of it herself. In one of the boxes, Jane found a folder labeled simply Press Cuttings. Inside were yellowed newspaper articles from 1977, their edges brittle with age. Headlines shouted in bold type, "Escaped convict slaughters family, Mother's Night of Terror, the Derbyshire Massacre." Beneath the sensationalism lay the familiar facts, the escape, the killings, the police chase. Yet what struck Jane most was the tone. The way tragedy had been converted into spectacle, the humanity stripped away for the sake of narrative. As she read, she felt a slow anger stir in her chest, not at the writers, but at the machinery of storytelling itself, the way it consumes pain and reproduces it as entertainment. Her mother had lived through something unspeakable, and yet the world had spoken of it endlessly, always at a distance. Even decades later, the case persisted in documentaries and true crime anthologies, its details rearranged but its core unchanged. A man's cruelty, a family's destruction, a woman's survival. But the story had never truly been about her mother, Jane realized. It had been about fear, the nation's fear of violence, of vulnerability, of losing control. Jillian had been cast as an emblem, her silence interpreted as strength, her grief converted into moral lesson. The real woman, complex, fallible, human, had been lost beneath that image. Jane closed the folder and set it aside. She could not bring herself to throw it away, but she knew she would not keep it either. Some histories are too heavy to inherit. In the following weeks, she spent long hours walking through the countryside, tracing the same paths her mother had loved. The moors were vast and empty, the air carrying the faint tang of peat and frost. From certain vantage points, the land appeared unchanged since the photographs taken in 1977. The same stone walls, the same expanse of white in winter, the same stillness that had both sheltered and betrayed. It was during one of these walks that she stopped near the site of Pottery Cottage, now North End Farm once more. The house stood at a distance, half hidden by trees, smoke rising from its chimney. She did not approach. She only watched, listening to the faint clatter of animals in the yard and the distant hum of a car on the main road. Life continued there, indifferent and ordinary. It comforted her to know that laughter could still exist in that place. The locals had long since stopped speaking of the murders, except as part of local lore. New residents might learn of it by chance, overhearing a reference in the pub or finding an old clipping in the library. For them, it was a historical curiosity, something that happened before they were born. Yet every so often someone would mention the odd quiet of the moors in winter, or how the snow seemed to carry its own memory, and the conversation would drift back, however briefly, to the year 1977. Back in the village, Jane visited the cemetery where her grandparents, her father, and her sister were buried. The headstones stood in a line, their names softened by decades of rain. She knelt and placed fresh flowers at each one. The earth beneath her hands felt cold but steady. There was no revelation, no moment of transcendence, only the quiet understanding that this ground had held her family longer than she had known them. She stayed there until the light began to fade, watching the shadows lengthen across the grass. It occurred to her then that memory is not about preserving the past unchanged. It is about allowing it to live differently in each generation. Her mother's silence had not been denial but protection, a way of letting the next life grow without being crushed by the old one. When Jane returned to the house that evening, she took the leather journal and the photograph from the mantelpiece. She decided that these two things, one filled with her mother's fragmented thoughts, the other capturing her family as they once were, would be enough. She packed the rest into boxes and arranged for them to be donated to the local archive, where the documents of the case were already kept. As she locked the front door for the last time, she paused to look back. The house stood in the dim light, like a living thing, worn, imperfect, and resilient. For all the years it had witnessed, it seemed untouched by bitterness. Its walls held the echoes of pain, yes, but also of endurance. In its stillness, Jane felt a kind of closure her mother had never sought. Later, on the train back to London, she watched the countryside slide past. Fields fading into moorland, the landscape dissolving into mist. She thought about how stories change shape when those who live them are gone. The Pottery Cottage murders would continue to exist in books, podcasts, and documentaries, but they would never again belong to the people who had been there. History, she realized, is never owned. It is borrowed and retold, reshaped by those who need it to mean something. Yet for her, meaning lay elsewhere, not in the crime or its cruelty, but in the quiet persistence of life afterward. Her mother had built something out of ruin, and that, more than the violence that preceded it, was the story worth keeping. Outside the train window, snow began to fall. Slow, deliberate, endless. The world turned white, erasing the lines of the land, the same way memory blurs the edges of pain. Jane watched it in silence, understanding for the first time what her mother had meant when she said the land remembers. It remembers not only what was taken, but also what endured. Years later, long after Gillian and her generation had passed, the Pottery Cottage murders found a new life in the digital age. Podcasts, documentaries, and streaming series resurrected the case for audiences who had not been alive when the snow first fell over Eastmoor in 1977. It was retold in soft, measured tones, accompanied by piano music and the faint crackle of archival recordings. The photographs of the house, the white stone walls, the narrow gate, the blackened chimney, became symbols of English Gothic tragedy. To listeners around the world, the case was no longer a local event, but a moral fable. Each version offered its own interpretation: the failure of institutions, the fragility of domestic safety, the psychology of a killer. And at the center of every retelling was a single object: the knife that Hughes had stolen from the prison kitchen. It was the detail that storytellers always return to, as if the blade itself carried the meaning of everything that followed. The knife, after all, was what should have been found and wasn't. It was the failure made visible, an absence so small and ordinary that it opened the door to catastrophe. In this way, it became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of the system's blindness. The inquiries that followed had measured the distance between negligence and tragedy in the length of 7 inches of steel. But as the years passed, that symbol took on another shape. In the public imagination, the knife became not an instrument of bureaucracy's failure, but of inevitability, as though Hughes's violence had been preordained the moment he touched it. The nuance vanished, replaced by the comfort of myth. The weapon was evil, and evil had acted. It was easier than confronting the subtler truth that the blade had waited, inert and harmless, until a man's mind decided what it would do. Among criminologists, the case still carried weight. They cited it in lectures about procedural reform, about the psychology of control, about how systems reflect the societies that create them. In academic language, Hughes was described as a pathological opportunist, a man whose rage thrived in moments of perceived weakness. Yet those sterile words did little to explain what ordinary people saw when they looked at his photograph. Not madness, but vacancy, the absence of empathy behind the eyes. In truth, the more the story was analyzed, the less it seemed to belong to the people who had lived it. The scholars and broadcasters reconstructed it into something clean, structured, comprehensible. They spoke of timelines, motivations, institutional reforms, but life and death had not been so orderly. The true horror had lain in the chaos, the randomness, the way violence can erupt in the middle of a cup of tea and forever divide time into before and after. For those who visited Derbyshire decades later, Pottery Cottage, or North End Farm, as it had been renamed, was simply another house among the folds of the moor. The new owners had no connection to the past. The garden had grown wild in places, but the walls were clean, the roof sound. Tourists who drove through Eastmoor might pass it without slowing, unaware that within those walls 5 lives had been extinguished in less than 2 days. The land, with its patient indifference, had absorbed it all. Yet sometimes, locals said, visitors stopped by the roadside, sensing something they could not name. Perhaps it was only imagination, the influence of legend on landscape. Still, those who lived nearby swore that the moors felt different in January, that the air grew unnaturally still, that animals avoided the fields for reasons no one could explain. The rationale knew it was nonsense, but superstition has always grown well in soil, watered by grief. The legend of Mad Billy Hughes had become a ghost story, told around pub fires or passed to newcomers as part of Derbyshire folklore. It no longer belonged to history, but to the realm of cautionary tales. The escaped convict, the trusting family, the storm that would not end. With each retelling, the edges of truth softened, replaced by moral certainty. The story had become about fate, not failure. This transformation, from fact to fable, revealed something about human memory. People rarely preserve the exact details of tragedy. They reshape them into something the mind can bear. Over time, the story of Pottery Cottage became less about what happened and more about what it represented. The terror of intrusion, the betrayal of safety, the fragility of domestic life. In that sense, it was never really about Hughes at all. It was about everyone who feared that evil might one day knock on their own door. For Jane, who now lived abroad, this strange afterlife of her family's tragedy was difficult to comprehend. She would occasionally receive messages from journalists or historians asking for permission to use her mother's name, her photograph, her quotes. Each time she responded with polite refusal. She did not want to stop the story from being told, but she no longer wished to be part of it. Her mother's silence had been her inheritance, and she intended to honor it. In her quieter moments, she sometimes searched the internet for her family's names. The results were endless: articles, videos, podcasts. Some were accurate, others were grotesquely embellished. She learned that people discussed the case on forums, trading speculation about what might have happened in those missing hours. The anonymity of modern curiosity disturbed her. It was one thing for the public to mourn the dead. It was another to consume them. One evening, unable to sleep, she listened to one of those new retellings, a documentary voiced by an actor with a slow, deliberate cadence. The story unfolded as it always did: the escape, the storm, the killings, the chase, the final gunfire. When the narrator reached the part about her mother's rescue, he paused for effect. "It was," he said, "a moment of divine justice." Jane switched it off. There had been nothing divine about it. Justice, when it came, was just another act of violence, a necessary one perhaps, but not holy. Her mother had lived not because of justice, but because of luck, timing, and a policeman's desperate reflex. It had taken decades for her to accept that there was no larger meaning. The tragedy did not symbolize anything. It simply was. In later years, when she returned to Derbyshire, she made a small pilgrimage to the archives in Chesterfield, where the surviving evidence from the case was stored. There, in acid-free boxes and folders, lay the material remnants of horror: the police sketches, the typed witness statements, the coroner's photographs. She held them briefly, then returned them to their place. Paper, she thought, could never contain what had truly happened. Standing in the reading room, she looked out through the window toward the pale expanse of countryside. It was late afternoon, the light thinning over the fields. She thought about the knife again, the object that had outlived everyone it had touched. Somewhere, she knew it still existed, sealed in an evidence locker, its edges dulled by time but still sharp enough to divide history. The myth of the knife had become the myth of the case itself. The idea that tragedy can be prevented by control, that if systems are precise enough, evil can be restrained. But Jane had learned from her mother that no system could guard against chaos. The lesson of Pottery Cottage was not about law or procedure. It was about the fragility of ordinary kindness. She left the archives as the first snow began to fall. Outside, the air smelled faintly of iron and wood smoke. The flakes drifted slowly through the air, settling on the fields in small, uncertain patches. For a moment she stood still, watching the land turn white, and thought of her mother's final words, that the land never forgets, but it forgives. It was true, she decided, but forgiveness was not peace. It was simply the earth's way of continuing, covering over the evidence of what it had witnessed. The snow did not cleanse. It concealed. And perhaps that was mercy enough, not to erase but to soften, allowing the living to pass through the memory without being destroyed by it. In the decades that followed, the Pottery Cottage murders continued to live not as history, but as a quiet undertone within the landscape of English crime. Every few years, a new generation of storytellers unearthed it again. Writers seeking to trace the genealogy of evil, documentary producers searching for the next dark fascination. The narrative was reconstructed with the precision of forensic art: names, dates, snow, fire, pursuit. But for all the retellings, something essential remained absent. No one could capture the silence. Silence had been the truest witness. the hours when fear lived in breath and heartbeat, when time stretched and language collapsed. For Gillian, silence had been both prison and refuge, the space between life and death. Yet in the years after her passing, it was replaced by noise, commentary, speculation, dramatization. The world had learned to speak fluently about crime, but it had forgotten how to listen to grief. Jane felt this acutely whenever the case resurfaced. Each new article or program came with the same phrasing: one of Britain's most shocking crimes, a story that still haunts the nation. Yet it no longer haunted the nation. It haunted her, privately, quietly, without audience or applause. For the world, it was entertainment disguised as remembrance. For her, it was inheritance. She lived abroad for many years, teaching literature at a university where her colleagues knew nothing of her past. Occasionally, a student would approach her after class to discuss a book that explored trauma or survival, and she would nod gently, offering the academic language of analysis while concealing the personal truth beneath it. Words like resilience and post-traumatic growth sounded admirable in theory, but she knew that in life they felt more like fatigue than strength. Survival, she understood, was simply the body's refusal to stop breathing. Yet silence, too, can become heavy over time. It gathers mass, like sediment at the bottom of a river. After her mother's death, Jane had promised herself she would never speak publicly about the murders, that she would not feed the world's hunger for tragedy. But as she grew older, she began to wonder whether silence itself could become another form of forgetting. Not peace, but erasure. She thought often of the small fragments her mother had written in that leather-bound journal. They were not confessions nor attempts at explanation. They were moments, sensory details preserved like insects in amber, the smell of cold bread, the creak of a stair, the sound of a match being struck. Her mother had not written to tell a story, but to hold onto the world's texture, to remind herself that she had once been alive within it. Those fragments haunted Jane more than any document or photograph. They spoke of what violence really takes from people, not only lives, but texture, the everyday fabric of being. And she began to realize that perhaps her mother's silence had not been meant to conceal the past, but to protect its dignity from interpretation. Still, she could not ignore the way the story had been distorted. The public's fascination with killers had grown into a kind of cultural ritual, the endless recycling of horror in service of curiosity. Hughes, once a man defined by violence, had become an archetype, stripped of context, his image circulating like a ghost through television and print. His face, with its hollow stare, appeared on streaming thumbnails beside the words, "True Story." Jane learned to avoid the genre entirely. The dramatizations felt like trespass, the actors' careful accents, the stylized recreations of fear. None of it resembled reality. Real terror, she knew, is not cinematic. It is mundane. It happens in silence, in the space between breaths, in the small act of waiting for something you cannot comprehend to stop. When she returned to England in her late 50s, she found the country changed, but the moors unchanged. Time had modernized the roads, the houses, the rhythms of life, yet the land itself remained stubbornly ancient. The wind still moved in long, hollow breaths. The heather still caught the light like embers in the evening sun. Standing there, she understood why her mother had stayed, not from attachment to place, but from recognition. The land was one of the few things capable of containing both horror and peace without contradiction. In her visits to the archives, Jane noticed how thin the paper had become, how the ink had begun to fade. History, too, is mortal. The typed pages crackled when touched, as though resisting resurrection. There were photographs she had never seen before, grainy images of snow, police vehicles, and a house half obscured by frost. She studied them not with morbid fascination, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as if trying to recognize a face in a dream. She realized slowly that her family's story no longer belonged solely to grief. It had entered the realm of heritage, a word that both comforts and chills. Heritage is what remains when experience becomes distance, when pain has been catalogued and placed on a shelf. In that sense, the murders had become part of Britain's cultural memory, studied alongside other moments when violence erupted against the backdrop of domestic normality. But for those who still remembered, even indirectly, it was not heritage, it was residue. On one of her final trips to Derbyshire, Jane attended a small local history event where a retired officer gave a talk about the region's most infamous crimes. The Pottery Cottage case was discussed near the end, its details recited with practiced solemnity. When the audience filed out afterward, an elderly man approached her quietly. "You're her daughter, aren't you?" he asked. His voice was kind, uncertain. "The one who survived?" She nodded. The man hesitated, searching for words. "We all felt for her, you know, still do. It changed the whole county." Jane smiled faintly. "It changed everything," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then added softly, "But it didn't end her. That's something." She thanked him and walked out into the dusk. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. In the distance, the last of the light spilled over the hills. She thought about his words. It didn't end her, survival as achievement, as moral victory. But her mother had never seen it that way. Survival, she had always said, was only the beginning of another kind of endurance. As darkness settled over the fields, Jane finally understood what her mother had meant all those years ago when she said the land forgives. Forgiveness was not absolution or forgetting. It was simply the slow acceptance that some things cannot be undone. The land had no need for justice, nor for closure. It carried the memory of violence the way it carried weather, absorbing it, reshaping it, waiting for time to dull its edges. In that silence, she found something close to peace. The world had filled the story of Pottery Cottage with noise, theories, analysis, dramatizations, but the truth of it remained wordless. It existed only in the stillness of the moors, in the weight of snow, in the quiet endurance of those who continued living. When she left Derbyshire that final time, she stopped her car at the crest of the hill and looked back toward the valley. The fields stretched out before her, a patchwork of muted greens and grays beneath the fading sky. Somewhere beyond the curve of the land stood the house, older now, quieter, but still there. She knew she would never return. The silence of that place, she realized, was not emptiness. It was memory transformed, the sound of survival lingering in the air long after the last voice had faded. There are stories that end, and there are stories that settle. The Pottery Cottage murders belonged to the latter kind, not a closed narrative, but a landscape that continued to echo. By the early 21st century, it had passed from the realm of recollection into something quieter and more enduring, a presence felt rather than told. The hills and moors that had once carried the sounds of pursuit now held only wind and the occasional cry of a kestrel. Yet beneath their silence, history still moved, faint, patient, unhurried. In the villages that bordered the Peak District, the memory had thinned but never disappeared. For the older generation, it remained part of a living geography, a point on the map where the ordinary world had once split open. They spoke of it rarely but always with the same tone, half reverent, half weary. The younger residents, meanwhile, knew it as a cautionary tale, absorbed through local gossip or a teacher's offhand comment about that terrible winter of '77. To them, it was something distant and almost mythic, like a legend carried in fog. It was strange how the details endured. Even after 40, 50 years, certain words still possess the power to summon an image, a cottage, a storm, a knife. People could not always recall the names of those who died, but they remembered the weather. The snow that fell for days without rest, the cold so sharp it seemed to still the air itself. The meteorologists had called it an anomaly, a historic freeze. But for those who lived there, it was something else. A season that had taken on moral meaning, as if the land itself had mirrored the hardness of the human heart. In later years, scholars came to see the case as an emblem of a particular era, the uneasy years between the end of one Britain and the beginning of another. It belonged to the 1970s, that decade of industrial decay and social fracture, when institutions once thought stable began to crumble. The story of Pottery Cottage was not just about one man's madness, but about a system that had mistaken routine for order. It had revealed how easily the state's machinery could grind forward without noticing the individual lives caught in its gears. To those who studied it, the lesson was administrative. To those who survived it or inherited it, the lesson was human. That safety is a fragile agreement, and once broken, it can never be entirely restored. In time, even the academic analyses faded, replaced by more recent tragedies that demanded attention. Yet the moral weight of the case remained. It resurfaced not in debate, but in instinct, in the caution with which a rural household locks its doors at night, in the instinctive pause when an unfamiliar figure appears on a lonely road. The people of Derbyshire might not know they were shaped by that memory, but they were. Every act of vigilance carried its shadow. For Jane, who lived far from the moors now, the story had become part of her inner landscape rather than her outer one. She had learned to live with it the way one lives with an inherited scar, no longer painful, but inseparable from identity. Sometimes she would come across a mention of it in a book or documentary, and for a moment she would feel the old tension rise, a reflexive tightening in the chest, a flicker of anger that strangers continued to interpret what could never be fully known. But mostly she felt something quieter, the knowledge that the story had finally detached itself from her. It now belonged to the world, and the world would do with it what it always does: distort it, narrate it, forget it, rediscover it. And yet, even in her detachment, she sensed a strange comfort, because for all the retellings, one truth remained. Her mother's survival had changed the tone of the story. It had denied it complete tragedy. The murders were not only an account of cruelty, but also of endurance, the persistence of a single fragile life against the machinery of violence. That persistence, quiet and unadorned, had become the story's final note. In her later years, Jane often thought about that, how her mother's silence had been misunderstood as weakness when, in fact, it had been a form of resistance. Refusing to perform her pain for the world had been her way of reclaiming what the world had taken. The public could analyze the facts and recite the failures, but the inner truth belonged only to those who carried it wordlessly. Silence, Gillian had once written in her journal, is the only honest response to horror. Anything spoken diminishes it. When Jane read that line again in her mother's handwriting, years after her death, she felt its meaning change. Silence, she realized, was not the absence of meaning. It was its vessel. It held the unspeakable in place, protecting it from the erosion of language. She returned to Derbyshire one last time in her 60s. The journey was long, the roads narrower than she remembered. When she reached the moors, the air felt the same, damp, mineral, untouched by time. She parked the car near the edge of Eastmoor and walked alone through the heather. The hills were bare and still, the sky an endless gray. Somewhere beneath her feet lay the traces of the path Hughes had taken that day so many years ago. The footprints long erased, but the direction eternal. The house, now barely visible through the trees, stood calm and ordinary. It belonged to another family, one that had likely grown up unaware of its history until someone told them over a pint at the pub. They lived there now without fear. The walls that had once held violence now held laughter. The world had turned, and the land had done what land always does: endure, absorb, renew. She stayed there for a while, listening to the sound of wind moving across the fields. It was not mournful, only steady. She thought of her mother's ashes scattered somewhere out there, mingling with the soil and snow. The idea that memory could return to the earth, not to haunt it, but to join it, filled her with an unexpected sense of release. Before leaving, she took from her pocket the small leather journal that had followed her across decades and continents. The paper inside had yellowed, the ink grown faint. She tore one page free, the one that read, "The land remembers. The land forgives." Kneeling, she pressed it into the ground beneath a tuft of grass, letting the wind fold the earth over it. Then she stood, breathed in the cold air, and began walking back toward the road. The sky had begun to brighten, a thin blue opening through the gray. In that light, the moors looked almost gentle. As she drove away, she thought of the countless lives that had unfolded since that winter of 1977, lives untouched by it, lives shaped invisibly by its echoes. Every story she knew leaves traces far beyond its ending. Some become warnings, others become prayers. Hers, she decided, was neither. It was simply a continuation. The quiet persistence of memory through generations who might never know the full weight of what they inherited. By the time she reached the main road, the moors were behind her, but the sense of stillness followed. It was not the silence of fear anymore, but of understanding. The kind of silence that does not erase, but completes. And in that silence, somewhere between forgiveness and forgetting, the story of Pottery Cottage, of Jillian, of the Morans, of a nation confronted by its own fragility, finally came to rest. Not with closure, not with redemption, but with continuity. The snow would fall again, as it always did. The land would remember, and that would be enough.